Welcome to the season finale of season 3 for the darker side of boxing. This episode is an episode that we have covered before for our Career Profiles podcast, and there were elements in that episode that certainly fit the narrative of the darker side of boxing. And this episode is about Tommy Morrison, the heavyweight from the 1990s who many will associate with Rocky V. But he was more than just Tommy Gunn in the movie. This was a man on a mission trying to become the world heavyweight champion for real. But along the way, there were many difficulties, many challenges, and many horrendous moments throughout Tommy's life. And then there is that age-old debate about Tommy Morrison and the end of his life. And that is a conversation that we will cover throughout the course of the episode. Now, before we begin the episode, I just want to give a shout out to Trisha Morrison, who has had her input into this episode. If anybody follows Trisha on social media, you will see her endless campaigns to clear Tommy's name, and she has had her say, and she will be on the show as an addendum to this episode. But we've got so much information that we didn't necessarily cover for our Career Profiles episode, and we hope that you do really get a full story about Tommy Morrison.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Career Profiles was predominantly based on his fighting inside the ring rather than the stuff that went on outside of it. We did touch on some of the bits, some of his arrests, but we didn't go as deep into it as we're going to go into it with this episode. So a lot of the information we're going to provide you is all to do with his outside of the ring antics, and as you say, Trisha coming on as well is going to be a great addendum to the show. So look, enjoy the story, and we're going to give you an in-depth version of the life of Tommy Morrison.
Now we will begin with Tommy's father, Timothy, also known as Tim Morrison Sr. He was a man of Scottish descent who had an early tragedy in his life when he was just a teenager. His brother, also named Tommy, died after an accident on a construction site while clearing scrub away for a bulldozer. But before the excavator could proceed, its operator accidentally dropped a blade on him. Tim held his dying brother in his arms, which soaked his shirt in blood. Still suffering with shock, Tim wore the blood-soaked shirt after the accident for days. In a state of unbearable grief, he ran off to California, but when he returned, he was suffering with severe depression. Tim, originally from Illinois, before he arrived in Gravette, Arkansas, south of Kansas City, was a migrant construction worker and propane delivery driver. He met Diana, a Native American, half Oto and half Ponca, and they married in 1966. 2 years after, their first child, Tim Jr., was born. A year later, they had Tonya, and then on January the 2nd, 1969, Tommy David Morrison was born. The family spent much of their time living in a trailer between the states of Arkansas and Oklahoma. When Tim Sr. suffered an eye injury from an accident on the job, he developed a severe case of photophobia, someone who is sensitive to light. Struggling with his disorder, he would tape over the windows in the house and sit in a dark room while drinking alcohol and dishing out physical and mental abuse on Diana and the boys. Tommy Morrison told ESPN, the magazine, "It was like we were living in a cave. We had to tiptoe across the carpet. Anything that went wrong was our fault. We'd leave the light on in the bathroom and we'd get the shit beaten out of us."
Well, Tim Sr.'s younger brother, Troy, told ESPN magazine in 1998 that he's an evil man. He scares me. He had pornography in the house, always by his bed and in his automobiles. Tommy would be looking at it too, right in front of his mum and dad. You won't believe this, but when I was 14 and my brother Trent was 16, Tim took us to a boxing tournament and he made us stop at a strip club on the way. And he brought us 2 strippers in tight outfits and he said they were for us. He was the devil in the flesh, but Tommy was his favourite. Troy saw firsthand how destructive and dysfunctional the Morrison household was. He said Tommy's father would drink, tie one on, and beat his mother in front of him. I spent a summer there. I witnessed it. For her part, Diana Morrison, who took the brunt of the beatings, declined to elaborate on Tim Sr.'s abuse. She actually told the ESPN magazine as well that I'd just as soon not go into that. But yes, I had broken bones. Valley Hope said in an interview in February 1999, both of his parents drank. He believes his mother is alcoholic and believes his father is not. Knows of no other family member other than his mother, he and his older brother to have problems with dependency issues. He went on to explain he began drinking alcohol at the age of 12 with his parents. In 2000, during an ESPN Up Close interview, Morrison elaborated on his feelings about his father. Him and I don't have the greatest relationship in the world. You know, years of seeing him abuse my mother seems like it drove a wedge between he and I's relationship as a father and son.
Tommy continued by saying, as a business, certain things that we would do, criminal type things, until I had a son of my own. I started realising how awful it was for him to subject his own son to do some of the things that we did. Now, we will explain what type of things Tommy did for his dad very soon. The one thing the family had a common interest in was boxing, which was very much a family affair, with both Diana and Tim born into boxing backgrounds. When Diana was a child, her father, John Harrison, a former Golden Gloves champion, taught her how to punch, and it was Diana's dream to become a boxer, but it never materialised. The whole of Tim Sr.'s side of the family all boxed, so it wasn't a surprise when Tommy and Tim both started boxing. Tommy was age 8 when he started, and was already big for his age. Tim Sr. was quoted as saying, he even had muscles in his shit. He would tell Tommy not to be a wuss on a regular basis, even at the age of 10, when Diana inexplicably tattooed boxing gloves on his left bicep, and she recalled it and said, it took me 2 hours. He flinched and ouched a lot, but I got them done. Tommy said about how he and his brother Tim Jr. started their boxing careers. Boxing in my family has been somewhat of a tradition. The last 5 generations on my father's side have all been fighters. My mother and father were always involved in boxing. They always wanted us to be involved in it, and we all started at a very early age. In 1976, Tim Sr. formed an amateur boxing team that included his younger brothers Trent and Troy, and his 2 sons, Tim Jr. and Tommy.
And Troy actually recalled how this all come about. He said, my parents owned a piece of property in Decatur, Arkansas, and the creek that run through it was Wolf Creek. I wasn't too crazy about it, but Tommy's dad lived vicariously through all of us because we all boxed. And he wanted to be a coach, even though he never put on a pair of gloves in his life. But he wanted people to think that he did. And that was fine. We were kind of self-taught, really. I mean, honest to goodness, we were pretty dedicated. We started out at the Rogers Boxing Club in Rogers, Arkansas, and it was just a long way to drive over there. So we started our own club there in Decatur, and he called it the Wolf Creek Boxing Club. But boxing could not stop the constant abuse the family endured at the hands of Tim Sr. Tommy absorbed plenty of beatings from his father as a child, and once from his brother, who actually smashed his skull with a baseball bat during a sibling scrap at a Toughman tournament. Diana suffered the worst beatings at the hands of her husband, so it was no surprise when she eventually struck back. However, she missed her intended target, Tim, and accidentally caught someone else. Tommy admitted that while he was at grade school, his mum stabbed his father's other woman in a bar. According to Dawn Gilbert, whose memoir came out in 2014 about her relationship with Tommy Morrison, she described in more detail about what happened that night. So Morrison Sr., his mistress Donna Faye Shepherd, and Diana were all in the same watering hole in Paul Husker. Diana sat alone at the bar while Morrison Sr. and Shepherd shared a booth. There was the usual taunting from Morrison, with Shepherd chiming in for good measure.
It was that extra badgering voice, perhaps, that proved one turn of the screw too many. Angry, humiliated and likely tipsy, Diana paid her tab and left the bar, only to return minutes later with a knife she had plucked out of her kitchen drawer. She approached the booth, flashed the blade and lunged at Tim Morrison Sr., who jerked back at the last instant, avoiding death by mere inches. Her straying husband had been the intended target, but it was Shepherd, seated next to him, who Diana fatally wounded. Shepherd died on March the 4th, 1973, and she was 30 years old. Diana spent 6 months in jail while awaiting trial, where she was finally acquitted. She didn't like to say too much about the incident, but in the ESPN documentary Tommy, she said, "It was hard on the kids, and it was hard on me, because I didn't know what I was looking at. Well, I knew that if I got convicted what I was looking at, but it turned out different, and I thank God for that." Tommy spoke to the New York Times about his parents and their dysfunctional relationship and said, "They tried to keep you away from their arguments, but 70% of the time you'd be sitting there and he'd come in and she'd be mad and throw a coffee cup at him and," Morrison said in that same Times interview, "but what do? You sit there and you watch it. I had to watch that for a lot of years. I became very withdrawn. I became independent. I started doing things on my own." One thing he didn't do alone was box, whether it was at the club or anywhere else. Tommy would claim an amateur record of 202 wins and only 20 defeats while fighting in the 4 states of Springfield Mittens, the Springfield Golden Gloves, Catherridge Golden Gloves and Park City.
Although some suggest his claim is far-fetched, Troy Morrison believes it to be plausible, and he said Tommy started in 76 and he didn't quit for years after that. "I started playing basketball, baseball, stuff like that in high school. I said, to heck with boxing, this is more enjoyable. I'm getting tired of traveling every weekend to go fight somewhere, you know." But that little guy started at 65 pounds and fought his way up. He may be counting some of the Toughman contests too, I don't know. But I would say that it might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but I wouldn't say by much. Now, Tommy was 13 when he actually began competing in many Toughman competitions under his brother's ID, who was 8 years older than he was. Formats varied from state to state, depending on each particular state's rules and regulations. The most common format stipulates the use of standard amateur boxing rules with 16-ounce gloves, protective headgear, and 3-round boxing bouts. Each round is 2 minutes and 60-second breaks for men and 1 minute rounds with a minute or 45-second intervals for women. Now, the creator of these contests was a guy called Art Dorr, who explained his idea to Jeff Jacobs for the Times Herald. And he said, "I've been putting on good boxing shows for a long time, and it gets frustrating to see the fans not get interested in 2 fine lightweight amateurs. You put a couple of big heavyweights with a little polish in there and they go crazy. So I figured, what the heck? We will give the people what they want." Eventually, 10 states would actually outlaw Toughman tournaments due to facilities, but they would flourish in the Midwest and the Southwest America, where the combination of action, beer, and ring girls was just too irresistible to stop. Now, Tommy Morrison told KO magazine, "I was a lot younger and not nearly as strong as some of the guys I fought. I started when I was 13, and some of the guys I fought were 21.
Tommy continued to say, "At 13, I was about 145 pounds, but I knew how to fight. You just had to survive the first round. They all came out firing in the first 30 seconds, and they're hell. But after that, they can't hold their hands up. Basic boxing skills take over, and you just beat the crap out of them, and that was enough to win." These fights were dirty, and Tommy recalled, "Well, I've been bit and I've been kicked," and he explained, "A lot of karate people get in there. They studied karate all their lives, and when you back them into a corner, they raise up their leg and try to kick you in the head. It's instinct, of course. In the fights that were at bars or fairgrounds, sometimes the referee was someone from out of the crowd, so it was anything goes. In the bigger Toughman contests, the state contests, the rules are strictly enforced." Young Tommy fought in barrooms like John Morrissey and Jack Dempsey and even Stanley Ketchell had done many years before at the county fairs, similar to the boo fights in England that Freddie Mills participated in back in the 1930s. His dad found him a fight in Woodward, Oklahoma against a bearded man, and according to his dad, he knocked the man out, and in his words, colder than a wedge. Tommy earned $300 for that fight and reminisced by saying, "The guy I fought that night even had hair on his back, and I'm thinking, what am I doing here? I was 13, I didn't even have hair on my balls." No hair on his balls didn't stop his 17-year-old babysitter from initiating Tommy's first sexual experience at the age of just 13. Although he may have joked about this back in those days, this wasn't a sexual experience, it was actually child molestation.
While not fighting, Tommy was actually a good student and a standout athlete in school, excelling in football and basketball particularly. For reasons unknown, he was cut from the high school football team. So in retaliation, he set fire to the field. He explained what happened in 1993 Associated Press interview, and Morrison claimed he only meant to scorch the grass, but instead he torched the entire grounds. He recalled, but about that time, a big gust of wind comes, burns down the field and the outfield fence. I think they knew who did it, but they could never prove it. Well, Tim and Diana Morrison eventually, with all the craziness in their life and their relationship, got divorced in 1980. She packed her bags and scooped up her 3 kids and moved to a small town in Jay, Oklahoma. Tommy lived with his mum, brother, and sister for the best part of 2 years, but he was always getting into trouble. He admitted, "I wasn't the model citizen in Jay, Oklahoma." As a teen, he stole car radios, he drank beer, and scrapped whenever he could. Although, in his defense, he said, "I never started a fight, but it didn't take that much to get me interested. There'll be parties, and the Indians would stand outside and wait for you. Then on weekends, you'd have to fight their older brothers and cousins. It stopped my junior year. By that time, I'd been through pretty much everybody." He left Jay in 1982 after dropping out of middle school for a year and went to live with his father in Missouri. Together they worked on a construction site and got along really well. But obviously when he come home, his dad was an alcoholic and he would change. And Tommy said he would beat me with whatever was nearby.
Tommy also worked for his father's associates, becoming a teenage enforcer who collected debts. He described them as Irish gangsters, telling the Associated Press in the year 2000, "There was a time I used to think that being a faction of an organised crime situation was cool. You say to someone, 'Here's the deal, you owe this much money, and what do you plan on doing? Get on top of that behaviour there, son, and if you don't, I'm not responsible for what's going to happen to you.' I didn't necessarily always have to be the one to do it, just inform them of where they live, where they hang out, who the friends are, and where the kids are." In her memoir, Dawn Gilbert contested this story, suggesting that it was Tim Morrison Jr. who, at the request of his father, had been a collector through violence. Although Troy Morrison could not recall any ties to an organised crime ring, he acknowledged that Tim Sr. had just envisioned himself as some sort of outlaw, and he said, "He had this fantasy. He was living like in the Jesse James gang or something, and he wanted the Morrisons to be this criminal outfit." He would return to Jay, Oklahoma, where he decided to concentrate more on his college football career, rather than boxing, while he was still participating in many Toughman bouts. He told KO magazine in 1991, "I'd laid off boxing for about 4 years to play high school football, and hadn't fought in 4 years on an amateur level. All I did in that time was fight in Toughman contests, which didn't require any training." During his hiatus from amateur boxing, he had a cougar tattooed over his makeshift boxing gloves and considered scholarship offers from 3 small colleges as a linebacker at Jay High.
However, he was convinced to move back into boxing. He said, "I got back into boxing in 88. My mother wanted me to fight in the Kansas City Golden Gloves. She talked me into that, and I went up there, fought and won. Diana told her son, 'Look, winning the Golden Gloves is a family tradition. On the one hand, you have college, which will always be there. On the other hand, you have the Golden Gloves in Kansas City, which is now or never. Think about it. Well, Tommy won the Outstanding Fighter Award at the Western Olympic Trials, and his surprise success actually suggested that he was a natural talent, even though he lost to Ray Mercer, gold medalist at the 1988 Seoul Olympics in the National Olympic Trials. Tommy said, "From the time my mum asked me to fight to losing to Mercer was about 2.5 months. I started thinking, hey, maybe this is what I ought to do." Now, while fighting in the amateurs, he actually caught the eye of a guy called Doug Draggett, who told the Kansas City Star, John Brown, who was going to be his associate, and I had a dream to get a young heavyweight and groom him. At the Golden Gloves, you could see Morrison had something because he won, and he was out of shape. John Brown was less enthusiastic about signing Tommy, and he told the Bonner Springs Edwardsville Chieftain about his first thoughts on Morrison. He said Tommy was out of shape and could barely go 2 rounds. He went 3 on guts. They were laying on each other. I thought, who cares? Even with his reservations, Doug convinced John Brown to sign Tommy as a professional, and in the summer of 1988, he moved in with his aunt and uncle, who lived minutes away from Kansas City, leaving behind his pregnant teenage girlfriend.
Tommy told the Kansas City Examiner there were just too many people, that after high school they just wanted to stay in J and get a job at 7-Eleven. I was sad when I left because I knew I would never be back there to live. I was full of mixed emotions, but I honestly knew if I ever wanted to amount to anything, I had to get the hell out of there. He worked in a ringside warehouse in the day and trained hard in the evenings with the hope of making a success out of boxing. John Brown and Doug Draggett didn't have any experience with professional boxing, so they hired Peyton Scher, a matchmaker for Don King, to help develop their protege. Tommy Morrison turned professional on November the 10th, 1988 at the age of 19, winning with a first round knockout over fellow debutant William Muhammad in New York City. By March 1989, Morrison had raced into an 8-0 record with 8 knockouts, 6 of them being in the first round. Then Scher moved on after he clashed with John Brown over the poor matchmaking. A few months after he departed, he said, "What you try to do in developing a fighter is to put him in with different styles and experience. They're putting Tommy in with experienced fighters, but experienced losing fighters." John Brown then used his initiative and forwarded a videotape to Bill Caton of Tommy Morrison knocking out a collection of opponents. Impressed with the power of this young white heavyweight, Caton went to his next fight against Lorenzo Boyd for a closer look. Following the second round knockout win, the former Mike Tyson manager signed as a co-manager in April of 1989. Caton would go on to explain what actually drew him to Tommy Morrison and said, "He has extraordinary natural ability with a natural left hook. A coordinated left hook is something that cannot be taught. It's something that you have to be born with. And Tommy has it."
And Caton continued to say that some great fighters became great, and I'm not making any comparisons between Tommy and the guys I'm going to name, but 2 great fighters, great heavyweights, legendary heavyweights, had a great left hook. That's Jack Dempsey and Joe Frazier, and they become great world champions by having extraordinary left hooks. Tommy had never been under the guidance of someone who knew what they were doing. He actually told the Kansas City Star, "I'd never had anybody to train me who knew what they were doing. My father has got one eye, and there would be angles where he'd miss. We had a heavy bag and a speed bag on the porch, and I lived a couple of blocks from the track where the football field was. That was the extent of my working out." Well, Caton moved quickly to bring in Kevin Rooney, obviously Kevin Rooney, ex-Tyson trainer, as the head trainer. And not long after he arrived, he also spoke to the Kansas City Star. He said, "I need to get Tommy to forget everything else those clans have taught him so far." But after Tommy refused to relocate to Catskills, Rooney moved on or was jogged on. We don't know. Depends on what source you want to and who you want to believe. But according to John Brown, the Rooney experiment was finished before it even began. He said Bill Caton kept wanting Rooney to train Morrison because Bill Caton thought everybody from New York was better than everybody else, you know. We were just a bunch of country bumpkins and we didn't know what the fuck we were doing. So I said, okay, Bill, send him out. I think Kevin was around for about 2 weeks and I actually kind of like Kevin, his style and stuff. We were coaching Tommy in the same Tyson style, which I do today to a bunch of guys. But Kevin's ego was so big. Kevin's what we call a one-man show.
John Brown continued with his reasons for getting rid of Kevin Rooney, and he said, I've had the kid, as in Morrison, from the amateurs to where he's at now, 9-0 with 9 KOs, and you come in here and act like you're a one-man show. It's not going to work, Kevin. Well, nobody knows what I know. So I called Bill and said, get him out of here, because this ain't going to work. We're going to come to blows, you know. It didn't make for harmony in the camp for damn sure. 2 more knockouts followed at the Trump Plaza Hotel in Atlantic City before the Steve Zowski fight, also in Atlantic City but at the convention centre. Although the former Mike Tyson opponent was put down in the 4th, he managed to survive the 4-round distance and be the first man to hear the final bell against Tommy Morrison. Even though Tommy had his knockout streak halted, his popularity was increasing thanks to Bill Caton. John Brown uncovered the secret to his partner's method and he said, Bill was so tenacious. I talked to the people at ABC because after I brought Caton on board after about 7 fights, he got Tommy on ABC. And later, I got to know some of those guys and asked them, how did he do it? And the ABC guy would tell me, because Bill was such a pest, we arranged it just so he would leave us alone. He would call hour after hour. Within weeks, Caton had improved Tommy's exposure. This young, good-looking and undefeated heavyweight was now being talked about as a future of the heavyweight division. The added public relations pitch was also helpful and clever, as Tommy's future manager, Tony Holden, explained to ESPN, while supposedly he's John Wayne's grandnephew, great-grandnephew. I don't believe it, but Tommy ran with it, and it got him a lot of publicity.
So John Brown also told ESPN, amazingly, the media never really checked on it. It was a great moniker for him. It was marketable. And Tommy's former trainer, Peyton Shear, joked, he's no more related to John Wayne than my grandmother from Lithuania. Troy Morrison explained the link and he said, I have an uncle, my dad's oldest brother. He was a boxer too. Actually, was an Army Golden Gloves champion. He went into the military and worked his way all the way to full bird colonel and ended up retiring in Orange County, California, where he met and knew John Wayne. They just said, it's likely we're related somehow. That's all that was ever said. And that story got bigger and bigger. And of course, the media, latched onto it big time. So it's possible nobody's ever done any DNA testing to say. So John Brown said the nickname that Tommy gets actually comes from his partner. So this is what he said. He said, Doug Draggett and I trained Tommy for about a year or so. And we were in our office one day trying to figure out a good nickname for him. And Tommy was there also. Tommy said, well, some people have said that they think that I might be related to John Wayne because his name was Marion Morrison. And Doug was a huge fan of John Wayne. And he said, yes, that's correct. John Wayne was, I think, from Oklahoma and blah, blah, blah. And that was it. That was the first of it. From now on, you're the great grandson of John Wayne and you're the Duke. Now, irrelevant of how it came about, the birth of Tommy the Duke Morrison was now established. Tommy wasn't bothered by it. He actually told the Philadelphia Daily News that I guess it is pretty interesting and it does get me some extra attention. But once I'm in the ring, it doesn't do much for me in terms of winning. And that's my number one priority right now.
Tommy continued and said, it doesn't mean a whole lot if you've got the name and can't fight. If you're lucky enough to get your foot in the door, you better be able to do something with that, and that's what I intend to do. Many believe that Bill Caton was also the man that got Tommy Morrison his part in the film of Rocky V. He even described how he did it to Bernard Fernandez of the Philadelphia Daily News in 1989 and said, My purpose was to convince these Hollywood people that it made as much sense to have a real fighter act the part of a fighter as it is for an actor to try and pretend he was the fighter. I got the call from Stallone saying he wanted Tommy to test for the role. I was elated. I knew he would be selected. Tommy has the makings of a superb actor. However, others believe that while Morrison was participating in just his 7th professional fight against Lee Moore, Frank Stallone watched him knock out yet another victim on ESPN and was intrigued. Frank then called his brother Sylvester and recommended Morrison for the character that would eventually turn into Tommy Gunn. Sly liked what he saw, got Tommy to do some rehearsals, and the rest, as they say, was history. The story centred around a country boy arriving on the boxing scene with nothing, winning it all, and then losing it again. Perhaps forecasting Tommy Morrison's real life and sad downfall. Sylvester Stallone spoke of his decision when casting Tommy, and he said, "Tommy was just what I was looking for. He was perfect to play the part of Rocky's alter ego. I don't think he will have a problem with the acting, and he will do well in the fight scenes because after all, he's a fighter. He's a really good fighter."
Well, before filming began, Morrison assured reporters that his focus remained on boxing, and he told the Associated Press that one of my main concerns is making sure it doesn't become an intrusion. Boxing and acting are two different things. We'll try to keep them far enough apart so I'm not in the gym thinking of lines while I'm sparring. Well, Tommy was being sidetracked away from the ring, although maybe not mentally, as he's put it, but Bill Caton dreamed of a Tommy Morrison and Mike Tyson fight. He said it'd be bigger than the Super Bowl and the World Series. It will be astronomical and will gross $200 million. However, the world heavyweight champion called Morrison a little twerp. He said, "I know this type from when I was in reform school in the boys' home. He's the type of kid I used to pick to blow dry my underwear." So from July to October 1989, Tommy fought and won 7 fights, 6 by way of knockout, and that was without no recognised trainer. Therefore, John Brown stepped up to the plate, but he struggled with Tommy, and Tommy, in fact, despised him as well. They just never see eye to eye. Now, John recalled, "I couldn't deal with him because, I'd ask him to work on fundamentals. I'd ask him to pick up the pace, and he'd throw a little fit. And I'd go, 'What's wrong with you?' And he and I get into an argument. And the next thing you know, in fact, we had to cancel at least 2 big money fights because he hurt his lower back trying to throw chairs at me." Anyway, from the ring, and Evander Holyfield was actually offered the part to play Union K, the rival who Tommy Gunn would eventually go on to knock out in the movie, Rocky V. But Dan Duva was dead against the idea, and he said the thought of Morrison beating up Evander is too fantastic, even for Hollywood.
Instead, Mike Mercury Williams accepted the role as Union Kane and would eventually sign to fight Morrison in a real prize fight years later. Sly and the Rocky cameras were at ringside for Tommy's 19th fight against Lorenzo Canade on November the 14th, 1989 in New Jersey, but he froze and produced a poor performance that was greeted with a chorus of boos. He notched one more victory in December before he took 6 months away from boxing to film Rocky V. Overwhelmed by his fast rise, Tommy said at a press conference before a screening of the film, "I think it's about what's happened to me, my good fortune, every day of my life, especially when I drive home to Jay. It's a town of 2,000. I started in Toughman contest and look where I am today." Tommy spoke graciously about the current position he found himself in and said, "I understand I am being presented with an opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime. I understand that there are a million fighters out there that would kill to be in my position. It all comes down to this. Can I fight? Yes, I know I can. Can I act? Well, I guess the people will see for themselves when Rocky V comes out. But I feel pretty good about it. I think I will do alright." Unfortunately, the film wasn't great, with many suggesting that it was the worst of all the Rocky movies, but it did get him recognition and attention. During those 6 months away from the ring, Tommy became a father to 2 boys by a second woman and had also bulked up his physique. He credited the team behind Rocky V for his new look physique when he told the New York Daily News, "Basically, before filming, I lived off Twinkies and Coca-Cola. I feel much better about myself physically."
Tommy continued, he said, these guys were the best trainers in the business, and it was a different kind of training for me. I think I look a lot bigger and I think I look better. I've also reduced my body fat count in my body dramatically. The weight I put on is in the right places instead of just being around the waist. And you can see the difference as well. If you do check, guys, the images of him before and after, you can see the dramatic changes. And well, John Brown had a different opinion on how that happened. He said, when we sent Morrison to Hollywood to work with Stallone, he was weighing probably about 210 to 215. And when he came back, he was weighing about 225 to 230 pounds. And you could tell he was muscled up a lot more. Well, Tom Vergitz would tell me that Tommy would get a package from California about once every 2 weeks. And that after he got that package, his strength training would always increase. So, I mean, we highly suspected that he was on something, but that was all I ever knew about it. Well, that something, of course, was steroids. We'll come into that later on. Tommy returned to the ring for real in June 1990, and he picked up a second round knockout of Charles Woolard in Kansas City. But things in camp were still in bad shape. And John Brown recalled the moment Tommy apparently threatened him as well. And he recollected that I had $1 million allowance because I wanted to lock that away so that no matter what happened to him, he would have $1 million at the end of it. And he came to me and he said, I want that $1 million. And I said, I'm not giving it to you. When your career is over, it'll be yours. And he threatened my life. And I said, you know, I thought, this ain't worth that. I said, okay, you can have it. He reinvested it in crazy things, he said.
The team decided that a new trainer was needed, so they decided on Tom Vergitz, who had earned a PhD in exercise physiology, but was a complete novice when it came to being a professional boxing trainer. He had a boxing family heritage and some amateur experience at the Virginia Military Institute for 5 years, but he was more of a dietitian than anything. He made his first appearance alongside Tommy on January the 11th, 1991, when James Tillis was sparked out in 1 round at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. Pretty much from the moment that Tommy had finished with the movies and began his rise up the heavyweight rankings, he was continually being labelled as the Great White Hope. It's not nice and it wasn't clever, as we look back in retrospect, but the racial angle was a way of selling fights, and unfortunately, Morrison fell into that category. Tommy didn't like it, but he understood it, and he told the Kansas City Star in 1990, "It's kinda sad, but to be honest, it's a big advantage being white. There aren't that many white fighters around, but I'd prefer to stay away from that because it's racist to start with. The public will perceive it the way they want to, which is their right." He went on to tell KO magazine, "People are hungry for a white fighter. Maybe I'm him, and maybe I'm not. A lot of people try and tag the Great White Hope thing on you as soon as you start something pretty decent. There's 2 reasons why I'm against that. Number 1 is because I think it's racist, and number 2 is because there hasn't been a Great White Hope that's accomplished anything. I like to think that I'm much better than those Great White Hopes."
And a very valid point there from Tommy, and I absolutely agree with him. Pat Putman of Sports Illustrated actually wrote, why don't they call him the Great Native American Hope, or at least the half a Great White Hope due to his mother's heritage? He said it's all just so silly. However, author Carlos Acevedo, who wrote The Duke, The Life and Lies of Tommy Morrison, explained perfectly why his team encouraged the racial angle and why they continue to hand him soft touches. And this is what he wrote. He said, because Morrison was white, he was viewed as a potential bonanza commodity, and devaluing a commodity by risking it with a legitimate fighters was out of the question for his handlers, which to be fair to him is pretty true. Tommy faced his first 10-rounder against the veteran Pinkland Thomas, who had marked 8 months sober before the fight. Now, we've done a Darker Side of Boxing episode on Pinkland for season 2, so please do go and check that one out if you haven't already. But this fight was actually televised on the Tuesday Night Fights in front of a home Morrison crowd at the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. Now, it ended up being a complete blowout. 2 rounds it was finished in, which Pinkland actually recalled. He said, "I had never been hit so hard, even by Tyson. It was as though I had been slammed repeatedly with a baseball bat. As I sat on my stool in my corner, I told my handlers, I'm through. The fight was stopped and Tommy Morrison was awarded a TKO." Pinkland, fighting his last professional fight that night, also made an interesting claim. He said, "I heard from several credible sources that Tommy Morrison's gloves had been loaded. There was no way to follow up on this because neither Kansas City nor the state of Missouri had a boxing commission. Once again, I'd been set up." Well, you take what you want from that statement. Honestly, we can't back that up with anything else. But by this point, Tommy was taking his outside of the ring activities to brand new heights, and he was also becoming very difficult to handle.
John Brown explained. He needed constant care. He needed constant supervision. He needed people watching him all the time and helping him to not do stupid stuff. I mean, sometimes he'd lay out in the sun and get a suntan, and he'd put butter all over his body. So the next thing you know, he's got a terrible fucking sunburn and he can't train for a week because of his sunburn. I mean, he did crazy shit like that all the time. On a more serious note, Dawn Gilbert wrote this. According to Tom, as in Tommy Morrison, and Verge, as in Tom Forgets, his life in Kansas City was truly a wild one. Supposedly, he participated in drugs and orgies on a near nightly basis. Nearly everyone who knew Morrison agreed that most of his problems during his Kansas City days revolved around alcohol. John Brown explained how they used to try and protect Tommy's image as an upstanding All-American, and he said, "We had friends at the bars in Westport, and they'd call us up at midnight, 1 o'clock, and say, 'Hey, you better come and get your boy, he's laying passed out on the floor. You might want to come and get him before the media gets here.' So we'd drive down and pick him up and throw him in the back of the pickup truck and carry him home." It was around this time that Tommy was arrested for driving under the influence in Grove, Oklahoma. But drink wasn't the only issue. Carlos Acevedo wrote in his book again that he would go on to use cocaine, meth, Adderall, Special K and marijuana, and while he dabbled in ecstasy and cocaine in the early 90s, it was the liquor that fueled his temper. Tom Forgets told a story to the Kansas City Star about how Morrison gave away a $1,500 bankroll while en route to a casino in Atlantic City.
So he handed the money out to homeless people on the streets along the way. And Virgil said, "That was Tommy. That wasn't one time I saw him do this. It was time and time again. He couldn't pass them by. But if he was drinking, he was liable to kick them." John Brown also told the Kansas City Star that there are some stories about Tommy and Westport in Kansas that are legendary. And Tommy and his entourage would get into a limo and load them up with women, and they'd all take turns on them. Now, Tommy told Elizabeth Morrell of the Kansas City Star, "There are a lot of beautiful women in Kansas City who need to be thanked for helping me stay in condition for years." In another interview, Tommy spoke about his preparations before fights throughout his career, and he said, "Sex became a part of my conditioning program. I'm serious. It was all the time. 3 different women a day for 7 or 8 years." Tommy had in another interview, "If I meet a girl, I'd tell her straight up, I might run into someone else I want to go with. Don't be offended." Was that acceptable to them? It had to be. There were enough girls. They were expendable, he said. He then told Sports Illustrated, "It was unbelievable. It was all right there. You could feed yourself as fast and as much as you wanted." Certainly loved the ladies. Well, Bill Caton explained to the Vancouver Sun how women would actually throw themselves at Tommy Morrison. He said they used to be all over him, everywhere he went. And I guess you can only beat them off with a baseball bat for so long. His attraction to women was more than anything you can imagine, including some of the most gorgeous women around. Of course, he's a good looking guy, and starring in one of the Rocky movies helped him, but he was a womanizer beyond anything I'd ever known.
John Brown said he tried to give Tommy advice on the number of girls he was sleeping with and his drug consumption, but his tough approach fell on deaf ears and said, "I gave Tommy a hard time almost every day because I wanted him to get up and run. If he was going to have sex, have it with one woman a day, not 5, to not drink or take drugs, and to train 5 days a week so we could become successful." Now back to the boxing, and 2 routine knockout wins followed the Pinkland-Thomas fight, which took Tommy's record to 27-0 with 23 knockouts. He was then originally scheduled to fight Ray Mercer on August the 9th, 1991 for the WBO World Heavyweight title, but Morrison had to withdraw after cutting his right eyelid during a sparring session. The fight was then rescheduled to October the 18th, 1991 and would take place at the Convention Center in Atlantic City, live on pay-per-view. Bill Caton told The Ring, "It's the right fight at the right time. Ray Mercer is a good opponent. He has credibility. I believe it will catapult Tommy into worldwide recognition." However, John Brown was not convinced, and he recollected and said, "When he, as in Caton, lined up the fight with Ray Mercer, we were all against that. We said, Mercer is not the right guy. Mercer is a rock, And he said, oh, Mercer has gotten old. He probably can't take a punch anymore and Tommy will knock him out. And we were like, Bill, I don't think so. You can't hurt Mercer with a truck. And that's exactly what happened. The fight didn't disappoint. The near sellout crowd of 8,000 plus, with Mercer managing to absorb an astonishing amount of punishment in the first 3 rounds.
He certainly had a granite chin, Mercer. He done really well to survive those 3 rounds, and then the fight changed with an overhand right to the jaw of Tommy Morrison in the 4th round, who had completely emptied his tank in those opening 12 minutes. In the 5th round, Mercer landed an overhand right and Morrison fell against the ropes after taking further unnecessary punishment and being unconscious on the floor. Referee Tony Perez, who was late in my opinion, finally stopped the fight. Now, in an interview with KO magazine, Tommy Morrison said, "I was in a state of shock, but believe it or not, I was also feeling a huge release of pressure. I wasn't happy about losing, of course, but I was glad the fight was over. I no longer had to be perfect. I had a loss on my ledger. Oddly, that made me feel good. It's a lot of pressure when you're undefeated." Now, John Brown has his own take on the Mercer disaster. He said, "It was sad that Tommy did his typical non-100% training. I heard later that he was taking some drugs at the time, something which to this day I don't know what it was, ecstasy or something. One of his gang members told me. And so Tommy was good for about 4 rounds and then he just dissipated." Morrison would later confess to the Boston Globe in 1996, "I blame nobody but myself for this situation. For 3 years, I was an animal. I partied every night. I had a different woman every night. I was afraid to be alone because when I looked in the mirror, I didn't like what was looking back at me." He blamed the defeat on his lifestyle. He said, "I had done a lot of drinking and partying in high school, and some of it carried over into my boxing career. If Mercer were here, I'd hug him to death. That fight was the best thing that had ever happened to me."
Tommy brutally dispatched Bobby Quarry in 2 rounds just 4 months later, which wound up drawing the highest ratings in the 12-year history of ESPN boxing. Less than 2 weeks later, on February the 28th, 1992, Tim Morrison Jr. met a 27-year-old woman at a Holiday Inn party in Joplin, Missouri. Author Carlos Acevedo explained, "He was in town to referee an amateur boxing tournament known as the Battle of the Bad at the Hammond Trade Center. He made sure to name drop his brother Tommy and how Tommy had co-starred with Sylvester Stallone in Rocky V. After the party broke up, Morrison insisted on driving the woman to her hotel. Instead, he burned rubber onto an isolated off-road a few miles away and raped her. The woman testified, "I crawled over to the side of the ditch and I threw up. And I just threw up and I urinated. I felt so dirty that I just curled up into a ball, hoping he would leave me there." Less than a year later, Tim Morrison Jr. was sentenced to prison for rape and spent the next 15 years inside. Absolutely horrific detail and incident and moment in Tommy Morrison's family tree there with Tim Jr. And there are no real words to express the feelings towards this, but we must keep on with the story about Tommy. Now, he continued his comeback trail, winning his next 3 fights, all by knockout, which included Jerry Halstead. In the summer of 1992, Morrison had a life or death fight with Joe Hipp, where he suffered a broken jaw and right hand, but still went on to win by a 9th round stoppage. Morrison showed an undeniable ability to withstand pain, and he recalled after the fight, "Each time I got hit on the jaw, I felt it separate more. This is what boxing is all about. I think I've raised some questions about what happens to Tommy Morrison after 4 or 5 rounds."
Yeah, a lot of people said he used to gas, and he did. He showed great heart in that fight, and that injury was so severe. He actually had his jaw wide shut after surgery. Caton told the Reno Gazette-Journal he will be on liquids for 4 to 6 weeks. The earliest he will begin training is in 4 months. He's the toughest fighter I've ever seen. If he can only learn not to get hit. The punch that broke his jaw, he shouldn't have been hit with. It was a sucker punch, he said. Now, Tommy returned to the ring 6 months later and stopped Marshall Tillman in 1 round, and then went into another violent fight against the guy called Carl the Truth Williams 1 month later in Reno. Now, Williams went down in the 1st and 3rd rounds, but bounced back up to almost stop Morrison in the 5th round after putting him down twice. And he would have won by the 3-time knockdown rule. However, the resilient Morrison forced the referee to finally stop the fight while Williams was being punished against the ropes in the 8th. So he's on the verge of getting stopped, knocked down a 3rd time. He fights on for that round and then stops him in the 8th. Now, after the fight, a concerned Bill Caton actually hinted at the reasons for Tommy's struggling in certain fights, and this one in particular, and he said, "Let's put it right. Tommy Morrison makes Mike Tyson look like a monk." Now, many boxing pundits and reporters were left questioning what Caton was disclosing here, but it didn't leave much to the imagination, considering that Tyson was currently serving time for rape in prison, which was a bit unfair to Tommy, who wasn't necessarily damaging anyone in his life. Only person he ever damaged really was the women he slept with and himself. Now, after knocking out Dan Murphy in 3 rounds, Tommy Morrison was given the opportunity to fight for the vacant WBO heavyweight title against a legend in Big George Foreman. To help improve Tommy with his defensive skills, John Brown encouraged Morrison to travel down to Tennessee for a few training sessions with Jerry Ace Miller. To keep Tommy out of trouble and away from his distractions, they moved him to a military camp in preparation for the George Foreman fight.
Best move they could have made in that situation. And
Yep.
Tommy himself actually recalled, "It's just like being in prison. I live boxing every minute. That's what I need." Morrison was also a little starstruck by his opponent, and he recalled, "I was in high school when he made his comeback. I went to Springfield, Missouri to see him fight. I love the man to death. Everybody loves him. But then he declared war. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to spank his butt." The fight took place at the Thomas & Mack Center in Las Vegas on June the 7th, 1993. Foreman got the largest share of the purse, a guaranteed $7 million, while Morrison was guaranteed his biggest payday of $1.25 million. Foreman went into the fight as the surprise betting favourite, considering his age. It was not the usual aggressive Morrison performance, which resulted in an unfair criticism, but in hindsight, I think we can all agree that this victory has impressed more and aged better with time. It wasn't pretty, but all 3 judges had Morrison winning by at least 7 points as he took a unanimous decision over 12 rounds. At 24 years of age, Tommy Morrison was finally a world heavyweight champion, going the full 12-round distance for the first time in his career. A certain Trisha Harding was in the crowd that night, sat behind his corner during the fight, and would be his future 4th wife years later. Morrison, who had just achieved the biggest win of his career, but failed to impress the cynical press. Michael Katz of the New York Daily News wrote, Morrison may have won the meaningless W bogus heavyweight title last night, but he did not win many fans at the Thomas and Mack against a man 20 years older than himself. Morrison bit back at the pessimists, telling the Associated Press, "If I was black or Hispanic, I wouldn't get any criticism. Because I'm white, people expect so much more out of me. That's a little unfair. But life isn't fair."
No, and to be fair, it was his best performance, though. I don't care what anyone suggests. It wasn't his typical style, and I thought he'd done the right thing, because I think if he had have fought the way he did, he probably would have been ironed out by George Foreman, especially towards the end of that fight. That's my opinion. So, yeah, a bit harsh. I thought that was really harsh. But Tommy celebrated hard with his enlarged entourage, let's just say, hangers-on by now. And he also celebrated by what we've been told with many gangbangs and orgies. And whatever else you can think of, Tommy probably did it. Now, according to an article in the Kansas City Star, Morrison partied in seedy motels. They quoted a former motel night manager about the comings and goings of the heavyweight champ. And he said, "We were surprised to see him. Why would he be in a place like that with such scuzzy trash? The place was a whorehouse with drugs. I don't know that he did drugs, but I know the girls did." Well, even with Tommy's outside of the ring antics, he was being positioned for a unification fight with the WBC heavyweight champion at the time, was Lennox Lewis. In fact, talks had advanced so much that a deal was pretty much done, where both fighters would receive $7.5 million each. But first, they needed to come through their respective bouts, and Lewis done his part when he managed to stop Frank Bruno. So all Tommy Morrison needed to do was defeat his Rocky V co-star, Mike Mercury Williams. Now, the fight was publicised around, obviously, Tommy Gunn against Union Kane, as in the real fight, not the Rocky, but it was an interesting angle. But just hours before the main event, an agitated Williams refused to fight Morrison, and he also refused to provide a urine sample. Now, nothing could convince Williams to uphold his contractual obligations that night, so he left the building and headed home. While he waited for his cab to arrive, Williams was approached by a reporter who asked him about the urine test, the missed urine test. Williams snapped, "Don't even bring that up. I don't do drugs." Just literally just said, oh my God, he just pleaded guilty there for me. So his manager, Bob Jordan, told the Associated Press after the fight, which Morrison does eventually have in a minute, which we're going to, the official word is Mike turned yellowed and left. He said he pulled a muscle in his back, and we had two doctors check him out, and they could not find an injury. His wife said there's nothing wrong with him. I was his manager. He's a bum.
Bob Arum also spoke to the Associated Press and said the situation in the locker room was unbelievable. Williams' wife was in tears, pleading with him to take the test and fight. It was a bad scene. Tim Tomaszek was in the crowd that night and was the backup fighter. However, he had called his mother the night before and told her that he would not be fighting, but would receive free entry to the card and would become a spectator instead of a participant. Top-rank officials searched the crowd with barely an hour to spare and found Tomaszek with a beer in one hand and a hot dog in the other. Not one to turn down $40,000, he jumped into the ring and went 4 rounds with Morrison in one of the most bizarre first world title defences ever. Next, it should have been the Lennox Lewis fight, but instead, Tommy apparently insisted on another tune-up fight against Michael Bentt at the Civic Centre in Tulsa 2 months later. Bill Caton told writer Bill Gallo, "Tommy is fighting Bentt because he wants it." Trent Morrison told ESPN. The night before he fought Michael Bentt, Tommy was at a concert drinking beer. No professional athlete that is up for a big fight is going to be drinking beer at a concert the night before he gets in the ring. Which is probably why Bill Caton told the Philadelphia Inquirer just before the fight, "I don't know which Tommy will show up. He has all the talent in the world, but I honestly don't know if he's hungry enough to be a great fighter." It ended in disaster. Morrison was knocked out in 1 round and lost a $7.5 million payday. Lewis's manager Frank Maloney said, "I warned against Morrison taking this fight. He should have been wrapped up in cotton wool before taking this fight, but now He's been exposed.
Well, Tommy's mum, not one to beat around the bush, she asked him, I bet you feel like a right arsehole now, don't you? I bet he did. Morrison spoke of his defeat years later and he said, it was your classic case of a blind squirrel finding an acorn. What most people don't realise is that any heavyweight out there can knock you out. I had him hurt. He was on his own way to going down. He bounced off the ropes and came right back down the pipe with a straight right hand. Hit me high on the head and buckled my legs and I went down. Well, after the Bentt defeat, Tommy Morrison tried to lay low in Oklahoma. He actually bought a leopard and a cougar as well for his ranch in Jay, Oklahoma, and he avoided the limelight and chewed the fat over his sudden change in fortune. He told the Springfield News leader after the fight, every paper and magazine I picked up said what an idiot I was. That annoyed me quite a bit. Not in the best of spirits. His annoyance was evident when in early hours of the morning on December the 7th, 1993, he was arrested and charged with a public intoxication and assault after he punched a 20-year-old male at a bar. Now, the Omaha World Herald wrote, the former WBO World Heavyweight Champion Tommy Morrison pleaded innocent to charges of public intoxication and punching a student he claimed was staring at him at a restaurant. Iowa City Police Sergeant Craig Lees said Morrison and an unidentified friend and their dates were eating at the county kitchen at 2:19 a.m. when Morrison approached a group of University of Iowa students seated at another table and hit William Strout from behind. Lee said Morrison told police the students were staring at him. Lees then went on to say it was a sucker punch. He taps the guy on the side of the head and knocks him clean out of the booth. The kid never saw him coming. The kids were eating and studying for finals. They were looking at him and saying, he's in that movie, Rocky V.
William Strout told the Daily Iowan, I was just looking at him when we made eye contact and he gave me a look like he was angry. He then looked away and resumed his studying when Morrison struck him in the head from behind, knocking him onto the floor. Strout said, he picked me up off the floor and told me to shut up and warned me not to look at him, not to giggle, and that he was going to kill me. His friend, Ted Skodol, who was at the table when the incident occurred, said he made eye contact with Morrison and was threatened after the alleged assault. Skodol said, he told me he was going to kill me as well. Strout, who was not injured, and his friends left immediately, Liz said, and called the police. Morrison, 24, who had a blood level of 0.24, also was charged with simple assault. Tommy posted bail, costing $260, and his lawyer, Jay Stein, declined to comment. The case did go to court in January of 1994, and Lynn Summers, a county clerk in Iowa City, explained to the Kansas City Star, there were two charges, one of simple assault and one for public intoxication. He was found guilty based on the sworn complaint of the officer on both counts and fined a maximum of $100 on each charge, plus a surcharge and court costs. Morrison did plead guilty, but he was adamant of his innocence, stating that the kid started it and it was self-defence, and then he spoke about his run-in with the law and said, I think it was blown out of proportion. If the media tells the truth, no one cares. It happened at a restaurant and the guy was obnoxious. I pushed him. I didn't hit him. Well, that's not what everybody else is saying, Tommy. In this instance, it's quite obvious that an assault took place and he pleaded guilty to it and he had to take his fine.
I think he was clearly pissed off at early hours in the morning. He's got a group of college kids staring at him because they think he's Tommy Morrison or Tommy Gunn, probably from Rocky V. And to say that it was self-defense is a bit hard to believe, I'd say. You know, big guy like him, some college kids, very unlikely. Well, after picking up 2 knockout victories in February and March of 1994, Tommy was back in trouble with the law on May the 12th. Now, just before his unanimous decision over Sherman Griffin, the Kansas City Star reported that a woman filed a lawsuit against boxer Tommy Morrison, contending she suffered neck, back, and head injuries when he allegedly knocked her to the floor of a Johnson County restaurant. Now, Christine E. Mook had previously complained to police after the alleged incident before filing a lawsuit in Jackson County Circuit Court. Richard E. McLeod, her attorney, said that Morrison shoved his client off a bar stool after she refused to talk to him. Police investigated the alleged incident and they filed no charges. It was just her word against his. Now, it was reported that an out of court settlement was agreed for an undisclosed fee. Now, we're not sure if this next story is related to the case of this woman being pushed off the bar stool or if it's a completely different incident. But in 2016 deposition by Dawn Gilbert, under oath, she recalled a night when a drunk Morrison slashed a woman in Kansas City. So she said, I can remember there was one girl that he had an altercation with at a bar, and I can't think of her name. The story was, I wasn't there, obviously, but I think it was before I met him. Now, he had broken a beer bottle and held it to her neck and cut her. And I remember him telling me he was going to go through court proceedings while we were together. And I believe he settled out of court in this matter. Now, John Brown actually did remember the girl and she remembered that she was a stripper. He said she actually called him up and she said, look, I need plastic surgery. It's going to cost about $12,000 and Tommy Morrison should pay that.
Wow. That's a story that I've genuinely not heard before with Tommy.
No.
It's a pretty scary story with some real recollections of that. Now, John continued on and said, oh God, I agree with you because I'm sitting here thinking she hadn't filed aggravated assault charges or anything. So I go to Tommy and I say, Tommy, we need to pay this girl. And he goes, oh fuck her, I'm not paying her anything. Fuck that bitch. By that time, we weren't talking a whole lot anyway, so Tony Holden was his consultant. So they decided they weren't going to pay her. I went back and told her, I'm sorry, but they're not going to pay you. I suggest you get a lawyer. And she did just that, and I think they ended up settling for $100,000. Now, following the Bentt debacle, Morrison was dropped by Top Rank, resulting in no more fights on HBO, and then he split with John Brown. However, they would spend years in legal disputes. Tommy told Bill Heisten of the Tulsa World, my relationship with John Brown never was too stable. I wasn't pleased with the way he handled things. He's the hero of every story he's ever told. Everyone who works for him hates his guts. Anyone involved in Team Tommy has got to be 100% in my corner. I heard a lot of bad things from John Brown. He said I was overweight and had the body of a truck driver. Those sorts of things. A manager's job is to shield his fighter from negative comments. They shouldn't come from the manager. When things didn't go well, he tore me down. Bill Caton, along with myself, will be managers. Now, according to Brown, his contract with Morrison had an option for a 5-year extension that Morrison refused to honour. Brown took Morrison to court and he said, I sued him because I wanted to validate my contract extension.
Yeah, just to say that John Brown, we don't mean to make this guy sound some sort of angel because he ain't. A lot of people don't like him either. So you take sort of his comments with a pinch of salt as well. I think he was difficult, just as much as probably Tommy was. But John Brown did continue. He said, I spent a lot of time and money making a contract that would hold up because I knew that it would take 3 to 5 years before you get to the top. Now, John explained that he was protecting himself. And so I had a 5-year extension that I sued him over and I won. Except when the court was over, I say, okay, he owes me about $600,000. How do I get my money? And the judge says, that's your problem. So I hired a private detective to find his money, but he couldn't find it. And I think to this day that he gave whatever money he had to Tony Holden. Tony Holden put it in his bank account, made it look like Tommy had no money, and I ended up getting nothing on that. And do you know what? I sometimes feel that Tommy's the man in the ring. If I was going to give you no money, tough shit. Unfortunately, move on, mate. Go and find yourself another fighter. Well, with John Brown out of the picture, Tommy turned to his advisor, Tony Holden, a television producer based in Kansas City, to be his long-term manager. Now, during 1994, Tommy had split his life between 2 women. So on weekdays in Tulsa while training, he would be with Dawn Gilbert. And on weekends at the ranch in Jay, Oklahoma, he would be with Don Freeman. Now, this love triangle would continue for the next few more years to come, and they will have some stuff to say, which we will read out. Then on June 19, 1994, Tommy bailed out a friend from the police station after he had an altercation and got himself arrested. This is probably one of the most craziest stories I think we've ever told. But so the Kansas City Associated Press wrote this. So Tommy Morrison was arrested early Sunday after allegedly punching a man outside police headquarters. Police spokesman Jim Dickerson said Morrison had just posted bond for a friend arrested in an earlier disturbance. When he got into an argument with a man posting bond for someone in the same disturbance. They got into a little argument and Morrison punched the guy square in the face. The man who got hit fell down the stairs and twisted his ankle.
A police officer was walking out the front door of the downtown headquarters and saw the 4 a.m. fight. Morrison was charged with non-aggravated assault and was released on bail about 3 hours later. The man allegedly hit by Morrison told the police he was not seriously injured and would seek medical attention on his own. His name was not released by police. The Tulsa, Oklahoma Associated Press then wrote on June 21st, Morrison's promoter said that Morrison may not have been the instigator in a weekend fight that led to his arrest, but that he must learn to stay clear of trouble anyway. Morrison, who recently moved his training camp from Kansas City to Tulsa, is free on bond. Holden said he was still awaiting a police report from Kansas City and said Tommy is very upset about this, strictly the fact that he shouldn't let this happen. He had to learn when there is any trouble to get up and run the other direction. Tommy has been in great control recently. He stayed out of trouble. He's getting his personal life together. He's been involved with his church and he's staying out of nightclubs. From all witnesses on the scene, it seems to be a minor situation, but because it's Tommy Morrison, it seems like it's totally blown out of proportion. Now, as suggested in the article, Tommy did move to Tulsa so he could escape the trouble that surrounded him in Kansas City in hope that he could readjust in different surroundings. Tommy's promoter, Tony Holden, was happy with his decision to move away from Kansas City by saying, "You can't babysit Tommy. There comes a point when Tommy has to take care of himself." Tommy was scheduled to face Ross Purity in his next fight and told the press, "I've learnt my lesson. I'm not partying anymore. I've gotten away from the people that got me in trouble. I have a new attitude."
Well, unfortunately, it was a poor performance from Tommy. He was nearly stopped in the 6th round when Purity landed a series of blows and then dug in an uppercut that left Morrison on the canvas. He recovered but struggled badly against a fight. It was 8-8 to take a draw in the end. In response, Tommy blamed a knee injury, claiming that he fell awkwardly in a dunking tank at a charity event in Jay, Oklahoma. He said, "I hate to be the guy who makes excuses, but my mobility wasn't good enough to do what I wanted to do." Well, despite the performance, Tommy Morrison was handed another chance at world glory with a fight against the WBO heavyweight champion Herbie Hyde on October the 22nd, 1994 in Hong Kong, and it was billed as High Noon in Hong Kong. Now, it was an opportunity for Tommy to get himself back into the world level contention, if he could win, obviously. He actually told the Philadelphia Daily News, "I don't look at this fight as a must-win situation, but it's a golden opportunity. It's been a long climb, painful at times, but after I beat Herbie, I will be right back where I was. That's a promise." However, on the night of the weigh-in, Barry Hearn withdrew his boxers, Herbie Hyde and Steve Collins, when their purse guarantees were not in place by the deadline, which was 5:30 p.m. local time on the Saturday. Now, Bob Arum was also involved of this event, and he was the supposed promoter, but he refused to come up with the cash to save the event. John Daly, a British filmmaker who actually organized the card in Hong Kong, tried to raise the money, which, according to Arum, was around $2 million. Now, Daly said that the boxers' purses were Bob Arum's responsibility, to which Arum did not agree. So there's like a dispute. Well, Barry obviously took his fellas and went, and he said there was a lot of hot air, a lot of good promises, a lot of warm words, but they don't pay the bills. And I'm not in Hong Kong for my health. We came here to see the fighters get paid.
Frank Bruno was also on the bill and was supposed to fight Ray Mercer, but his fight was also cancelled. Morrison never got his opportunity to fight in Hong Kong for the World Heavyweight title, and he said years later, "I would have killed Herbie Hyde." But we'll never know. Their bout was never rescheduled. From February the 7th, 1995 to May the 1st, 1995, Morrison annihilated 3 soft touches in a total of 11 rounds, setting up a clash with the inactive and semi-retired Donovan Ruddock. A raucous crowd of roughly 6,500 packed the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City on June the 10th, 1995 to see if Morrison could put his name in the mix for a future fight against Mike Tyson. Morrison was knocked down in the first round and Ruddock was given a standing 8 in the second before the fight was stopped in the 6th round with less than 10 seconds left. Morrison got the win, but he struggled to beat a man who had lost 3 out of his last 6 by knockout and was at war with his promoter and was out of shape. Referee Ron Lipton defended his decision to stop the fight by saying, when the final stoppage came, Ruddock had his back to the ropes and wasn't throwing a punch. Tommy hits him, snaps his head back, and I'm going to let Razor continue? No way. He's a good man. I didn't want to see him get hurt. Following the victory, Morrison was able to secure the Tyson fight, but negotiations had begun to challenge the WBO champion Riddick Bowe. As the fight neared completion, it was cancelled because Bowe decided to relinquish the WBO strap and fight Holyfield in their trilogy fight. That left the door open for a fight between Morrison and Lennox Lewis for the vacant WBO title. Tommy told the Philadelphia Daily News, "When they offered me Lewis, I said sure, but only if I got the same money I would have gotten for Bowe."
And Tommy continued, he said, those guys all had heart attacks. They said there was no way they could do that, but they ended up doing it anyway. In fact, I'm getting a little more for this fight. It was billed as laying it all on the line, with Lewis earning $2.5 million and Morrison 2.1, a lot less than what they could have earned if they'd had that first fight. Frank Maloney said that it was make or break for both fighters. The loser of this fight has nowhere to go. He might as well go out on the beach and walk into the sea. However, Lewis was very confident and he told the Ansbury Park Press, "I don't see anyone out there who scares me. I look at a boxer like Morrison and I see someone who will look good on my resume, nothing more." When on October the 7th, 1995, in Atlantic City, more than 8,000 spectators gathered at the convention center to watch a bad night for Tommy Morrison, who was dropped 4 times before referee Mills Lane decided to stop the fight in the 6th. Morrison explained how difficult it was for him in that ring that night. He said he was tough, very tough. Trying to fight guys like that with that reach is tough, especially with one eye. I'm not used to fighting with one eye. He's definitely got some of the longest arms, I'll tell you that. After the second round, my eyes started swelling. I faced just about every kind of adversity there is in the ring. Broken hands, broken jaws, hurt legs, hurt back, cut eyes, you name it. But never a swollen eye. That was an adversity I wasn't used to. When you're fighting with one eye, it makes for a depth perception problem. Well, Jonathan Rand of Tulsa World wrote this on Tommy Morrison after the Lewis defeat. He has gone as far as he can in the heavyweight ranks, and it just isn't far enough to beat a contender in his prime.
Rand also wrote, Lennox Lewis didn't just beat Morrison when he knocked him down for the 4th time and stopped him midway in the 6th round Saturday night. Lewis also exposed him as a semi-skilled worker. Interestingly, Morrison announced that he had signed with Don King 2 weeks before the Lewis fight, as Mr. Slippery tried to cash in on a Tyson-Morrison fight. Morrison said, "King has never done me wrong, and he takes care of his fighters." He then added, "I don't mind being in a room full of snakes, if the lights are on." Now, even though he had lost, Tommy was now in a good position to potentially earn a big money fight with Tyson, so being associated with King made good business sense at the time. However, 9 days after the Lewis defeat on October the 16th, 1995, Morrison was accused of punching his son's mother, Tammy Witt, in the face. Author Carlos Acevedo wrote in his book, "In the early hours of Sunday the 15th of October, Morrison and Tammy Witt, mother of his 5-year-old son Mackenzie, clashed at a party in Grove, Oklahoma. According to Witt, Morrison had crashed her party, and when he was asked to leave, he became violent, punching Witt in the face and biting the finger of another guest, Kin Dunham. Both women sought medical attention, and Witt filed charges against Morrison. A few days later, the Delaware County District Court hit Morrison with 2 misdemeanor counts of assault and battery. Morrison's lawyer, Stuart Campbell, immediately accused Witt of gold digging, and Witt told KOTV in response to questions about her motives, "I don't care for his money. I want him out of my life, and my son's life." Among the witnesses to the altercation was one of Tommy's friends called Tony Rutherford, who told the Associated Press Tammy slapped Tom, and Tammy had Tom's finger bending it. He pushed her out of the way, and she fell down. He said, "All right, let's go. Let's leave now."
Well, Tony Rutherford continued with his version of events. He said that's when Kim Dunham came up and started going stupid on him, cussing and carrying on and telling him he was going to whip his ass, or she's going to whip his ass. She grabbed him and he pushed her back. And that's when she went to screaming and carrying on. That's all that happened. That's it, he said. But a contradictory version of events was written by the Tulsa World, saying that Stuart Campbell acknowledged the photos that show Witt with a black eye, but he contends Witt sustained the injury after Morrison and his friends left the party. But on October the 25th, 1995, Morrison, through his lawyers, pleaded innocent and posted a $1,000 bail. For all his mistakes, it's important to mention that Tommy Morrison did have a good heart. Holden told the Tulsa World in 2013 that Tommy couldn't stay away from bad influences, and he also did some tremendously generous things for a lot of people. He would read the paper and see that someone was in an accident or having a rough time or tough time, and he'd give them $10,000 without even thinking about it. In 1995, he donated a percentage of the gate receipts of a fight to Oklahoma City disaster relief. And there were countless stories of Morrison handing out hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to homeless people on the streets. One, obviously, we mentioned earlier. He also helped pay for a church fellowship and founded the Knockout AIDS Foundation in 1996. So, for all of his misdemeanors, he did have a good heart when he wasn't probably high. The new year started well for Tommy, who appeared as Leo, the boxer, in the CBS sitcom Sybil in January. Now, 27-year-old Morrison said in a conference call to boost his television appearance, "Boxing is not a sport to stay in for a long run. Acting has a lot to offer, and if I dedicate myself to acting like I have to fighting, I should do well. Anything makes more sense than getting punched in the nose." Well, Tommy and Sybil Shepherd, who's one of the actor, they actually realised a common interest, and their common interest was Elvis Presley.
In the early 1970s, Shepherd had dated Presley, and that was enough for Morrison to show her his tattoo of the King on his backside. And he told the Kansas City Star, "Of course, I had to show her my butt. She got a kick out of it." The following month, and just 5 hours before Tommy Morrison was scheduled to meet Arthur Weathers at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas on national television, the Nevada Athletic Commission, the only major boxing state that required boxers to have a mandatory pre-fight blood test for HIV, cancelled the bout. On February the 10th, 1996, the Nevada State Athletic Commission enforced an indefinite medical worldwide ban on Tommy. Mark Ratner, the Commission's executive director, said in a telephone interview that under the advice of the state attorney general, he could not disclose the nature of Morrison's suspension. However, within hours, the word had spread that Tommy Morrison had tested positive for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. Ratner did not squash these rumours when he said, if Morrison had been bothered by a physical disability, he would have announced it. And if he twisted his knee, I'd say it. According to Dr. James Nave, a member of the commission, a few days before the fight, Tommy was asked to take an HIV test, but he refused, citing religious beliefs. Nave informed Tommy that the test was mandatory, so on February the 8th, Morrison took the HIV test and also underwent a routine physical examination. According to Ratner, it took 48 hours for the results of the HIV test to become known. Again, Carlos Acevedo explains in his book that because of privacy laws and the threat of litigation, past, present and future, the steps for the testing protocol from February the 8th to February the 10th are nearly impossible to reconstruct.
Well, Carlos Acevedo continued. He said Mark Ratner received the results of the HIV tests on Saturday afternoon around 12:30 p.m. and announced the cancellation of Morrison Weathers at 1 p.m. For an hour or so, Ratner tried unsuccessfully to locate Morrison, who had left his hotel room where Dawn Gilbert, his companion in Las Vegas, remained for lunch. Eventually, rightly or wrongly, Ratner reached Tony Holden, and he told him that Tommy Morrison had tested positive to HIV, which is really shit, really. He should not be passing that information on to Tony Holden. He should be telling that to Tommy. Either way, Holden said it was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life to tell Tommy the news. A follow-up test confirmed that the Nevada State Athletic Commission had discovered that Tommy Morrison was HIV positive and the original diagnosis was correct. Dawn Gilbert wrote in her memoir, Tony Holden had immediately began to seek medical help for Tom. He first obtained an appointment with Tulsa AIDS specialist Dr. James Hutton, and after a full examination, Dr. Hutton told Tom that the HIV was rampant in his system. According to him, the numbers were off the charts. Diana Morrison recalled in the 30/30 documentary, she said, I was in the living room in Jay waiting for him to fight, and then they announced that he could not pass his physical, and I knew what it was. We had talked about this before. This is when the producer asked her, talked about what? And Diana Morrison replied, the HIV. The producer then asked, he knew before? Diana Morrison responded, he suspicioned. He did not know for sure. Tony Holden told the Associated Press, I took him to several doctors after the Nevada test confirmed that he was HIV positive, and we got the same result. Without a doubt, he was HIV positive. He was diagnosed by several doctors with HIV. Then under oath for their court depositions, his two would-be ex-wives, ex-wives, we'll go into that in a minute, actually described aiding Tommy Morrison with his pill regime.
When Morrison appeared on the Maury Povich show and Larry King Live, he reiterated that the second test administered by a physician he chose in Oklahoma confirmed he was HIV positive. On CNN with Larry King, Morrison said, the first thing I wanted to do, obviously, was to get somewhere I could get more blood drawn. I know that there is a possibility of there being a mix-up. My hopes hinged on that. Once we got back here, then we obviously had the test done. And we just found out earlier today that the results of those tests did confirm that I have tested positive for the virus. To questions about how he contracted the disease, however, Morrison remained evasive. At the Marriott press conference, he said, that's not important. Very few people give a crap about how I got it. It's what I do now. I've had thousands of sparring partners, 49 fights, a promiscuous lifestyle. Go fish. His brother Tim Morrison Jr. suggested that Tommy had contracted HIV through his sexual encounters. In an interview with ESPN on the 30 for 30 documentary, he said he was sleeping with everything in the country. He had run across some medicine that you shoot right into the side of your shaft, and you do it about 10 minutes before you have sex, and it makes you good for 4 hours. You know, if you're poking a brand new wound in the side of your penis 10 minutes before you have sex, you know, to me, that's how he got it. sharing dirty needles with his sparring partners when administering steroids is another theory of how Tommy contracted HIV. Some suggested that it could have happened in the ring. Even Mills Lane got tested because he was covered in blood during the Lewis fight. Tommy himself believed that HIV could have been passed on from the ring.
Tommy said, I certainly believe that it could have been passed on the ring. I mean, I've dealt with cuts and nosebleeds to the mouth. You know, everything in the ring. I believe it could. 100% I believe it could happen. Now that the public were aware that Tommy Morrison was HIV positive, the Kansas City Free Health Clinic saw a significant spike in appointments for HIV tests. Sherry Wood, executive director of the clinic, said, our phones have just rang continually. They want appointments to be tested. They want to know if it can be anonymous. They want results quickly. And Brian Schmidt, a phone operator for an AIDS hotline run by the health department, spoke to the Kansas City Star about the volume of calls he was receiving. We've had about 20 people call, women who said, hey, I slept with this guy. And believe it or not, calls from men whose girlfriends had previously seen him. So they're all panicking, obviously, the amount of girls he's been sleeping about with. Not funny, but it sort of makes me chuckle. Tony Holden gave a different perspective on what was happening with Tommy as well. He told ESPN people wouldn't shake his hand, wouldn't come close to him, wouldn't let babies next to him. And I saw that. And you took a kid from the height of his stardom, being in movies, to the point where everyone wanted to be Morrison's friend, to the point where, man, nobody wanted to be in the same room with him. I witnessed it, and it was heartbreaking. Diana Morrison also recalled in the documentary, Tommy, nobody wanted to touch him. Nobody wanted to be around him. It just really, really hurt him. It hurt him inside. It really did. Now, things couldn't get any worse. In March, Special Judge Martha Sue Thompson gave Morrison a suspended sentence for the assault and battery charges at the party and fined him $600. In addition, Morrison was ordered to perform 30 hours of community service.
In private, Morrison married Dawn Freeman in Las Vegas on May the 18th, 1996, but continued to see his other woman, Dawn Gilbert, who wrote that while in Mexico, she witnessed Tommy inject himself with what she called a HIV inoculation. She was stood there and in great sympathy when he removed the needle and, in her words, plunged it into her hip, saying, "Oh, there, now you have AIDS too." He thought it was funny and continued to laugh for the next few minutes. This time, I was scared to death, knowing the virus is most easily transmitted by needles. I shrieked, and he just shrugged. No apologies, no nothing. I was speechless and horrified. Gilbert also wrote that Morrison had once physically assaulted and threatened to kill her. Yet 2 months later, and 4 months after his marriage to Freeman, Tommy married Gilbert in Tijuana, Mexico, in a courthouse with their cab driver, Raul, as their sole witness. Not long after Tommy's second marriage, on July 17th, Morrison suffered a seizure and lost consciousness while at the wheel of his pickup truck after overdosing on what most reports called medication. Many local newspapers stressed that Morrison had suffered a reaction to legally prescribed drugs. Tommy blamed his blackout on amino acid supplements. He told the Kansas City Star, "I was in a hurry and didn't want to measure it out and took 3 times as much as I should have. Fortunately, it happened in a town and I wasn't going down the highway 70 miles an hour." His friend Holden said it was just a scary call, but he walked away from it unscathed. By September of 1996, Tommy made a U-turn on his medication, telling the Kansas City Star, "I'm not taking any medications up to this point. Why try and fix it if it ain't broke? There may be a time I have to reconsider, but now I'm perfectly fine."
When he continued to say that from day one, they wanted me to get on medication, and I chose to approach things in a more natural way with vitamins, workouts, and diet. He then told the Desert Sun, "I don't have a lot of confidence in all this medication. I've chosen not to take it, so I don't think that HIV causes AIDS. Some of the research I've read and some of the doctors I've talked to, there are still a lot of unanswered questions." It hasn't been proven scientifically to my satisfaction that HIV leads to AIDS. They've been saying for 2 years that HIV may not be the sole cause of AIDS. It's not the cause at all. I believe that in my heart. I'm not a doctor, but it's never been proven. 1 month later, in October 1996, Tommy is caught transporting a loaded firearm in Jay, Oklahoma. And the Beaufort Gazette wrote Tommy Morrison received a 6-month suspended sentence and a $100 fine after pleading guilty to transporting a loaded firearm. Morrison was also ordered to pay court costs and spend 30 hours talking to students about AIDS. So Tommy could have actually faced up to 6 months in prison for the charge, but a Delaware judge approved the plea. The report concluded that Jay police said they found a loaded .22 caliber pistol in the car. Tony Holden said, a lot of times they set it up where it's easier to plead guilty than to try to fight the charge. Well, the following month, Tommy fights again, but not in the US where he was suspended, as other states followed the Nevada Commission lead in suspending him in the states kind of thing. He's licensed, he didn't have one. But in Tokyo, Japan was the fight that was going to happen there. Now, initially, his opponent was supposed to be Anthony Cooks, who had actually spent a total of at least 10 years in prison on a variety of charges from armed robbery, attempted robbery with a dangerous weapon, and larceny of merchandise.
A few days before the fight with Cooks, a warrant is issued for his arrest on charges that he had raped a 15-year-old girl in Oklahoma. Because of these allegations, Cooks was dropped and replaced with Marcus Rode, who was then subsequently knocked out in the first round. The bout was fought under the condition that if either fighter was to suffer a cut, the bout would be stopped and it would go to the scorecards. This was on record the only professional bout in history involving a HIV-positive boxer. George Foreman was also on the card and was full of praise for Tommy Morrison. During his post-fight press conference, he said, Tommy Morrison did something very important today. He's back in the ring and executed his profession. No one can ever say now, what if, or maybe, or he should, or he shouldn't. It's done now. Now it's time for someone else to come and do it again. But he's already stepped in. The water's fine, and nobody can take that away from boxing. The possibility of a Foreman-Mora rematch was being discussed, and Morrison was up for it, and he said, if the opportunity presents itself, I would be stupid not to fight him. Foreman portrays a good guy, and this could prove to everybody that there is no risk. It's strictly up to him. However, the rematch never materialised. Dawn Gilbert recollected the start of the new year when she wrote, we talked almost daily, but by the end of the year, our visits were seldom. When we did see each other, Tom was always nearly out of it on pot. Essentially, he spent 1997 as a huge pothead, and in doing so, he pushed me further and further away, to the point that I moved, left no forwarding address, and changed my phone number.
On March the 20th, 1997, Tommy was arrested in Fort Scott, Kansas, while driving 52 miles an hour in a 30 mile per hour zone, and charged with driving under the influence. His blood alcohol level was 0.16, twice the legal limit of 0.8. Morrison had been on his way back from a friend's house where he had a few glasses of wine, that's what he said, with dinner after speaking with the kids at Appleton City High School in Missouri, which is what he was told to speak to the kids about AIDS. That's what he was doing. Well, he had addressed the first year students about drinking too much in excess and HIV. Here I am teaching about responsibility, and then I pull something stupid like that. It kind of makes me feel uncomfortable. These frequent arrests were now catching up with him because he had now violated the terms of his suspended sentence from his last attainment. In April, he pleaded innocent to all charges and waited for a trial date. But then on July the 17th, 1997, Morrison withdrew his guilty plea on the drunk driving charge and accepted a 1-year diversionary agreement. That agreement kept Morrison from a trial and a potential prison sentence, but it also meant that he would not be allowed to be arrested again in the duration of the next 12 months, Well, depends on what the arrest is. We'll come to that in a minute. However, just 1 month later, while driving under the influence, he was involved in a traffic accident that injured 3 people. A police report said Morrison was driving a 1997 Lexus on US 59 when he collided with Carl Shecklar's vehicle, which rear-ended a truck driven by Laura Lee Scroggins. Shackler and Scroggins and the 12-year-old Pamela Scroggins were actually taken to hospital. Police found a half-empty bottle of Crown Royal in his vehicle, along with 2 loaded pistols and several whiskey miniatures still unopened. After failing to a after failing a field sobriety test and refusing a breathalyzer, Morrison was taken into custody. Witnesses would later testify that Morrison was seen at a Walmart before the accident, unsteady on his feet and reeking of booze.
Morrison pleaded innocent to the traffic accident and was acquitted of following too closely, and the DUI count was lessened to driving while impaired. He was ordered to spend time in treatment. Then in December, the Reno Gazette reported Tommy Morrison faces 6 months in jail after he was convicted of driving under the influence and 2 related charges. On December the 20th, 1997, the Associated Press wrote, a Delaware County judge deliberated for about 4 hours before convicting Morrison of driving under the influence, carrying a firearm while under the influence of liquor, and lawful transportation of an opened container of alcoholic beverage. The jury recommended a 6-month sentence and a $500 fine on the DUI charge and $500 fines on each of the other 2 charges. Sentencing is set for January the 6th, 1998. On January the 7th, the New York Times reported the former heavyweight boxer Tommy Morrison was sentenced to 6 months in jail yesterday in Jay, Oklahoma, after being found guilty in a drunken driving case. Special District Judge Alicia Littlefield followed a jury sentence recommendation despite a plea to consider Morrison's health. Morrison is free on bond pending an appeal. While appealing his bond, Morrison went to Colorado for a ski trip, and he returned to Tulsa the night before his ranch house in Jay was burnt to the ground. On January the 27th, the Jay, Oklahoma Associated Press wrote, investigators don't know what started the fire, but they say the blaze apparently was an accident. Shannon Rowland, a state fire marshal spokeswoman, said, at this point, nothing looked suspicious. Fire Chief of Jay, Mark Gola, said he asked the fire marshal's office to investigate because I was just wanting to make sure there was no foul play involved since nobody was at home and that the fire was not used to cover up some other illegal act. Gola said the 2-story stone and cedar home was valued at around $500,000.
Well, Gola also said when firefighters arrived at the home at 4:26 a.m., the house was fully involved. The house itself had already collapsed and all that remained was an attached garage. Later, Morrison would claim that arson had been the cause and that he had been targeted because of his HIV status. Tommy moved to Arkansas, bought an acre of land with a cave on it and filled it with food, water, and guns, and convinced himself that the world was coming to an end at the stroke of midnight on January the 1st, 2000. He asked, am I going to be around in 5 years? I'll be in heaven in 5 years. The world won't be here in 5 years. Well, as we mentioned, he was married twice at the same time, so the bigamy went on for 2 years. But when Tommy, he just decided he had enough with both marriages, so he decided to end one. And he said it was driving me wild. I couldn't lie anymore. So in the summer of 1998, he broke the news to Freeman and he split with Gilbert. Around this time, Freeman noticed a change in Tommy. She asked if he was on methamphetamine, but he denied it. But she said Tom started hanging out with people who were on crank, which is meth. If people didn't know, crank is meth. And he let it get out of control. I could see the residue on the bathroom counter, and I was finding gutted out ink pens everywhere. I saw the person I was in love with slowly dying in front of my eyes. On Thursday, July 16, 1998, at 3:42 a.m., Morrison was arrested again for driving under the influence. My goodness, he just needs to stay away from a car. For nearly 5 miles, Tommy Morrison weaved through Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, with a petrol pipe and hose attached to the tank of his Jeep Cherokee. Tommy's excuse was that he had actually borrowed his car to a friend and had only just picked it up, and he just didn't realize it was a petrol pump that was attached to it, and that, of course, there were drugs in the car.
What the hell's going on there? Like, how did you not notice a petrol pump coming out of the car? Oh, Tommy. He's got some absolute hilarious moments in his life, and I suppose this is one of them. And it reminds me very much of a certain Mr. Mitch Green as well, when he was at that petrol station pumping gas for people. It just automatically makes me think of that moment in particular in his story. Well, Tony Holden, he was worried about his friend, and he told the Kansas City Star, he says he's doing okay, but he's sick, I'll tell you that. He's got the virus. Morrison continued drinking and smoking marijuana, taking methamphetamine and Adderall. Dawn Freeman said in a court deposition, I understood that he was actually taking the Adderall and somehow liquidating it and using it in a syringe to put it into his arm. He would spend a lot of time in the bathroom, and I would find the spoon that he used. Morrison's health was now declining because of his newfound addiction to meth. For the rest of the year, he laid low in Fayetteville, Arkansas, taking his meds and narcotics. On January the 14th, 1999, Morrison received some good news about his growing legal troubles. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals overturned one of the charges stemming from his 1997 conviction and reduced his sentence from 6 months in prison to just 30 days. The Joplin Globe reported, the court said a 9mm pistol found in a leather briefcase on the back seat of his car did not fit the legal definition of carrying a firearm. 2 months later, he missed a court date for his recent arrest in Broken Arrow because he was in a rehab centre in Missouri. Morrison had been sent there as a result of winning his appeal in January. Instead of 30 days in jail, Morrison received a suspended sentence and was ordered into a drug treatment program. Morrison told the Associated Press, my life was spinning out of control. People thought I was crazy. He failed to complete his rehabilitation period, forcing Special Judge Bill Culver to sentence Morrison to finish out the remaining 18 days left on his original suspended sentence from his 1997 Fort Scott conviction.
So while in Delaware County Jail, his health actually declines to such an extent that officials released him, citing good time, and cancelled the rest of his sentence. The reported cause of his deterioration was HIV. Morrison was back in court a few days later, this time in Tulsa, where he pleaded guilty to a raft of counts hanging over him, which carried a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison. In June 1999, Tommy underwent a series of surgeries for chest and bicep implants and liposuction in Tulsa by an unlicensed doctor, Dr. Scott E. Gilbert. Morrison's body looked a mess after surgery, but he still had the energy to hit the town with his pal called Landon, where they actually played pool for the evening. Now, Dawn Gilbert wrote that he discovered, as in Tommy, discovered that his left arm implant was protruding from a hole the size of a silver dollar. As the evening progressed, his drainage increased, as did his drug-induced high. Finally, in a desperate move to curtail the drainage, he went to the garage, got some pliers, and pulled out the implant. Then he looked at himself in the mirror, noticed how lopsided he was, so he proceeded to pull out his right arm implant in order to balance out his appearance. My goodness. Well, not long after disfiguring Tommy, Dr. Gilbert had his medical license revoked after one of his patients passed away. The Tulsa World wrote that Dr. Gilbert was accused of using wood screws and superglue on patients, coercing sedated patients into approving additional surgeries, allowing unlicensed personnel to perform procedures, and stealing narcotics to support a long-time drug habit. Well, in July 1999, Tulsa County Special Judge Carl Haskins ordered a competency evaluation on Tommy, and then in September, he gave Tommy a 2-year suspended sentence. However, he was arrested again and charged with drug possession. Later that month, on September the 16th, Morrison was stopped by police after driving erratically in Fayetteville.
What the hell was this doctor playing at? Dr. Gilbert? Like, what's going on? Like, this is mental. Absolutely mental.
Absolutely, what the hell? Exactly. He's like that doctor from Simpsons, isn't it? A surgeon from fucking
Yeah,
Simpsons.
yeah,
Basically destroyed him.
he's destroying people though, not just Tommy. He's destroying people
Not
quite clearly
exactly.
from
Yeah.
that information. He was an unlicensed doctor who was practicing and doing things to people that were just absolutely wrong. Absolutely
Wow.
wrong. Now, when the police searched his car, they found marijuana, more than a gram of cocaine, and a firearm. He spent another night in a police cell and was charged with possession with intent to distribute cocaine, possession of marijuana, driving under the influence of drugs, simultaneous possession of drugs and a gun, careless driving, refusing to submit to a drugs test, and driving without liability insurance. And that's one hell of a raft of
Oh my God.
allegations and charges against him. Then on Thanksgiving Day in 1999, Morrison fled the scene of a crash a few miles west of Huntsville. The Madison County Sheriff's Department said Morrison fled into the woods when the Corvette in which he was riding ran off the road and hit some trees about 4 miles west of Huntsville. Investigators think Bart Bumpus of Fayetteville was driving the car, and he was later arrested on weapon, drugs, alcohol and driving charges. Police found Morrison about 3 hours later attempting to use a phone at a house less than a mile from the crash site, where he initially gave a false name. At the crash scene, officers found several handguns, including a .45 caliber, two .22 calibers and two .40 calibers. Police also found a 12-gauge shotgun they described as a riot gun. Sheriff Philip Morgan said many of the weapons were equipped with laser sights and all were loaded with ammunition. Morgan continued to say, "I don't know what so many guns were doing in that car. We're going to have to investigate that further." Morrison faced more charges of cocaine possession, simultaneous possession of drugs, and firearms, being a felon in possession of a firearm, and possession of drug paraphernalia, misdemeanor possession of marijuana, and driving while intoxicated. Tommy had his bail revoked and spent the Christmas holidays at Washington County Prison. On December the 24th, 1999, while in a Fayetteville, North Carolina prison, Tommy's lawyer, John Hudson, requests that the court do a medical on Tommy to see if his HIV has developed into full-blown AIDS.
Sounds like he's going to war with laser beams on his blimmin' guns and shit. What the hell? Well, the reason for the medical request was because John Hudson had seen huge changes in Tommy's mental and physical condition. On January 14, 2000, Tommy Morrison pleaded guilty to an assortment of charges stemming from his September arrest and was sentenced to 10 years in prison with 8 years suspended. Now, while Judge William Story considered Morrison a flight risk, he actually denied him bail. And then Judge Story then told the court, "Your situation is terribly sad, Mr. Morrison. In many respects, you have had it made financially and squandered it all with your involvement with drugs. I hope you have learned your lesson." Tommy replied, "God put me in jail to wake me up." Judge Story responded, "I hope you got the call." To which Tommy answered, "I made a promise to my wife and to God that if I ever put another drug in my body that wasn't prescribed by a doctor, that God would take me out of this world." Now we're going to use ESPN magazine because they wrote an article on Tommy Morrison's time in prison. And here's some of the segments from this article. You can find it online. Local prison officials at Fayetteville say that from the start they kept Morrison isolated so he could have access to nurses and medication. Deputy Jack Kimball said, "I remember thinking, this guy looks awful." Morrison remembers thinking, "I got to get out of here." So he spit his dinner into a cup to make it look like he was sick. He drew dark circles under his eyes with cigarette butts and groaned loudly. The guards bought it. And after 35 days, Morrison was sent to a hospital. Kimball said, "How would I know he was faking it? I'm no doctor." Well, Tommy was subsequently transferred downstate to Southwest Arkansas Community Correction Center in Texarkana, a converted hospital that houses multiple drug offenders and felons convicted of non-violent crimes. Morrison said, "That's the place where I got tortured."
On his arrival in Texarkana, he was sent to the special needs floor for evaluation and admitted, "I wasn't playing their game, and they didn't like it." The floor supervisor was a woman of German descent whom Morrison called a Hitler bitch. He said she was the sadistic bitch who almost broke him. Tommy recalled, "To qualify for this floor you had to be mentally retarded, mentally and physically handicapped, schizophrenic, and half the guys walked around spitting and drooling on themselves. They kept me there to screw with my head." Prison officials said they suspected Morrison was hooked on methamphetamine, but he denied it and said, "I've never had a drug problem. I just fooled around with drugs a little. After I retired, I figured I'll find out what the big deal is. But that was it." Tommy said they kept sending him to the box, 115 days worth for trumped up reasons. He said guards planted contraband in his room and that he even got one 30-day stint in isolation for agreeing to send a female guard an autographed poster. The warden, Daniel McGuinness, denied Morrison's allegations by saying the hole was merely slang for the cell used for administrative segregation and that Morrison was segregated at times but never with the lights on 24/7 or in a metal box. Other employees considered Morrison delusional, and one worker explained, "They don't call them personality disorders for nothing. The guy didn't think he had HIV or a drug problem. Come on, he's got no credibility. There are some metal rooms in here now, and they do keep the lights on at night, but the rooms on his floor don't even have bars on the doors. There's not even a fence outside. This place is kindergarten compared to a real prison."
Well, Tommy pointed to his tired eyes. Eyes, he said, got fried in the hole. Eyes he's underlined with permanent tattoos, and said they're all lying. McGuinness is a muppet. They put me in the hole to break me. You're talking a metal box in the middle of the summer. I was convinced they were never going to let me out. I was in that place with 300 people, but I felt completely alone. At this time, Tommy also explained to ESPN in 2000 what he believed HIV was and how he believed he contracted it, in saying he didn't get it sexually. HIV is just a piece of dead skin. That's all it is. Every time you pierce yourself with a needle, you're putting the microbes into your body. These little pieces of dry skin. That's exactly how I got it. Well, finally, inmate 64281, Tommy Morrison, was released from prison on February the 28th, 2001. He was met at the gates by Dawn Gilbert, who had reignited his relationship with, and together they decided to try for a baby. Now, Tommy was absolutely skint, so he sold his cars and his house, with obviously the cave on the end of it as well, and filed for disability. He went to his family and asked them to co-sign a loan, which was attributed to the medical assistance for the possibility of them having this child with Dawn Gilbert. But they said, his family turned him away, and they said they wanted no part of an AIDS baby, apparently. Well, Tommy and Gilbert obviously got united and closer from that comment, and they actually remarried in September the 17th, 2001, 5 years to the day after they were first married. They moved to Sparta, Tennessee, and Tommy continued taking his HIV medication as he had done in prison, calling it no more than a nuisance than diabetes. Trouble was, he began shooting up Adderall once again and then moved back onto meth not long after. 2 years later, Dr. Ann Kissling took Morrison's sperm, washed it in a centrifuge, tested it for HIV, and combined it with an uninfected specimen with one of Dawn Gilbert's eggs.
The first cycle in July 2002 didn't work, but then on December the 30th, 2002, the second cycle did. By January 2003, Tommy looked healthier and sounded more like his old self. 9 months later, his third son, Tristan Duke Morrison, was born, and life looked a whole lot better. But by spring 2004, Tommy had split with Dawn Gilbert, got back on the meth, and found himself homeless. He moved in with his sister Tonya, and then in April 2006, thanks to a friend, Tommy was sharing an apartment and training vigorously in Phoenix under the tutelage of a local trainer named Mike Munoz. Tommy had initially hinted that he thought HIV was just a dead piece of skin, but he now claimed that his 1996 test findings were inaccurate and that he was and had been all along HIV free. He told Kansas City Star about the Nevada State Athletic Commission's result. "I'm convinced it was a false positive. I've never had any signs. The only thing that's changed in my life is I've had too much time on my hands and I'm not fighting." Interestingly, the Nevada Athletic Commission secretly lifted his suspension in 2006 and then denied ever suspending Tommy in 2016 court records. They then denied in 2020 that a diagnosis of HIV was ever made. Dr. Margaret Goodman, who is the head of Voluntary Anti-Doping Association in Las Vegas, told the media in 2007 that John Hyatt was a renowned pathologist and physician and he reviewed Morrison's 1996 results. Trisha Morrison, who married Tommy in 2011, said, "Turns out he, as in John Hyatt, never did that, as in review the results, and was not a physician or a pathologist." Now, in July 2007, the New York Times reported that Tommy Morrison took 2 HIV tests in 2007 and a third specifically for the Times. HIV experts reviewed the 3 tests and concluded that the 1996 result had actually been a false positive.
We'll come to that a little bit later, but according to Dr. Daniel R. Kruitsky's, a Harvard professor who directs AIDS research, said the mixed results in the Jan 5th test makes it likely that the antibody result is a false positive. It's hard to know for sure what's going on, but I suspect that he never had HIV or was HIV infected. So, for Morrison to fight again, he would have to be HIV free. Now, obviously, people are saying that maybe he hasn't got it. Otherwise, most commissions, especially the major ones, would deny him a license. In February 2006, Morrison participated in an extended interview with the website Boxing Scene, where he outlined his plans to sue the Nevada State Athletic Commission. However, his unlicensed lawyer, Randy Lang, made him false promises. Now, after attempting to gain a license in Arizona where a negative HIV test had to be confirmed, Morrison pulled out, citing injury. He then wound up in Chester, West Virginia, and the injury he picked up before the blood test in Arizona had now healed. He actually signed with Top Rank and was approved to fight for the first time since November the 3rd, 1996 against a guy called John Castle. Newsday reporter Wallace Matthews had a conversation with John Castle. He asked him, "What were you told when you were offered this fight? Were you assured that he was now HIV free?" Castle responded, "I was told that he had it. Now he doesn't have. And the medical association or something says that I can't get it even if he did." Well, Morrison won the fight in 2 rounds, but Bob Arum actually refused to show this fight. Instead, he showed still images of that fight on its own. Really strange. Tommy was then added to an undercard in Texas, but as in Arizona, the blood tests he needed to take before fights were incomplete. So he was pulled out from that card. Then in an unsanctioned fight in Arizona, Morrison was due to fight under MMA rules against John Stover, but the day before the fight, Lang revealed Tommy has tested positive for HIV antibodies, and he always has.
He also said that the Morrison team were doctoring blood tests or falsifying documents. Tommy said it was all Lang's idea and said if there was ever any fraudulent stuff going on, it was him that was doing it. He insisted, "I only know what the doctor told me and what Randy told me. I am negative. I went and took all these tests. They told me I'm fine, the doctor and Randy. Randy is a greedy person. He got exposed and now he's trying to hurt me." Tommy knocked out Stover in the first round of a boxing match and not an MMA fight because they switched the rules at the last minute. On Cush TV, Morrison said, "It, as in HIV, can't pass through sex from a man to woman. Anyway, it cannot happen. I don't care what people tell you, it cannot happen. It happens from man to man because that's forbidden of God. You know it's an abomination. You're going to pay the price. What causes AIDS is drugs. Now, on February the 9th, 2008, Morrison faced an unknown fighter by the name of Matt Weishar in Leon, Mexico, on the undercard of a pay-per-view headlined by Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Morrison avoided having to provide his HIV status to the Mexican Commission and stopped his opponent in 3 rounds. Tommy went on to knock out Corey Wizkid Williams in the first round of a Muay Thai fight on January the 31st, 2009 in Wyoming, and ended his boxing career with a record of 48 wins and 3 defeats, with 42 by way of knockout. Now officially retired from the sport, Morrison told the Kansas City Star how he had been teleported out of danger from a Springfield bar where an overwhelming feeling of evil predominated. Morrison said, "I know it sounds fucked up, but I'll tell you what, it happened to me. It's real. But things like this don't work for anybody that doesn't believe it."
So on February the 17th, 2011, Tommy Morrison is arrested and charged with possession of marijuana. I mean, a little bit of weed. After posting bail for $2,500, he was released from Leon County Jail to await a hearing. Now, because he had already been convicted twice of drug-related offences, he was now at risk of another jail sentence. But when the arresting officer, Bo Wallace, actually died in a motorcycle accident on May the 26th, charges against Tommy Morrison were dropped. A few months passed and Tommy was extradited from his home in Tennessee back to Kansas to face charges on a March 2010 drug charge that had gone under the radar in Wichita. This time, the counts included felony possession of controlled substances and misdemeanor possession of paraphernalia for use. He posted bail for $50,000, apparently. I mean, that's a lot of money because he ain't got nothing. But in 2011, Tommy, still dreaming of his comeback to the boxing ring, he actually married Trisha Harding. And together they campaigned that he was never HIV positive and Tommy stopped taking his medication. According to his dad and uncle at this time, Tommy had a T cell count of 18. Most doctors see a count that low as a clinical diagnosis of AIDS. Tommy was quoted as saying that the anti-HIV drug AZT will kill you, pizza will not, and doctors are up to no good anyway. I will trust an attorney before I trust a doctor. When speaking of AZT, Tommy said, "You unravel that little piece of paper in the bottle and you read about the side effects, and they match identical to the symptoms of AIDS. So it's the medication that's killing people. HIV's never been proven to cause AIDS. HIV ain't ever killed anybody." In August 2013, Elizabeth Morel of ESPN reported that Morrison's mother, Diana, said that Tommy had full-blown AIDS and was in his final days. She also stated that Tommy Morrison had been bedridden for over a year.
He gave his last interview in 2012 for the Fight Night Champions Still Standing series to promote the game. He'd lost all of his hair and was clearly unwell. Then on September the 1st, 2013, Tommy Morrison, who was barely recognisable, died at the Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha at the age of 44. According to the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, Morrison's cause of death was cardiac arrest, resulting from multiple organ failure due to septic shock caused by Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection. Trisha, who has shared with us her findings, explained that 12 feet of surgical gauze was left in Tommy's chest to rot for 8 days. He was placed in a medically induced coma 2 days before he died of cardiac arrest, septic shock, and septicemia and multiple organ failure. Now, as requested by Tommy, he had no funeral. Trisha said that he would be cremated and pieces of his ashes would be put into little boxing gloves and sent to people who loved him. Trisha remains adamant that her husband never had or was properly diagnosed with HIV or AIDS and continues the legal fight against false HIV diagnosis. Now, the next part of our episode is about information we kindly received from Trisha, which we will read out. Now, Trisha's kindly done a timeline around the time Tommy passed away. So we've got a timeline that me and you are going to go through, Johnston. And for you guys listening, it is really a chronology of what the past 10 years have been like for Trisha Morrison, trying to get an ultimate finalisation of what was really going on with Tommy Morrison. Now, it started in July of 2012 with Tommy's ante-mortem, which revealed no HIV and no AIDS. On September the 1st, 2013, Tommy then dies of cardiac arrest, septicemia, septic shock and multiple organ failure. Post-mortem examination reveals no HIV, no AIDS. September the 17th, 2013 to July 2014, Trisha does due diligence and no one is now owning a diagnosis of HIV of Tommy in Vegas, 1996. Not the physician, not the lab, not the commission. July 24th, 2014, Trisha files a pro-SE with Nevada District Court. No attorney in Las Vegas will handle the case because they do not want to go up against the Commission Attorney General's Office or Quest Diagnosis, which is the largest lab in the world.
Continuing on, December 2014, court records reveal defendants secretly lifted Tommy's medical ban in July 2006. 10 years later, from February 10th, 1996, which we did mention earlier, June 2015, court records now reveal under oath no ban was ever made in 1996. June 2016, court records now reveal no diagnosis of HIV was ever made in 1996. Trisha did present a mini video to us as well, which I'm sure she might even share with others on social. That same month and year, court records state Tommy's contract with Don King in 1996 now did not exist. Nevada State Athletic Commission in court records that Tommy violated 5 laws, and that was the reason he was not given a boxing license. But then confessed 2 years later, those rulings did not actually exist in 1996. Definitely going back on a lot of their stuff, the commission here. September 2016, judge rules from the bench that the tests Tommy was given did not diagnose the HIV virus. October 2016, Nevada federal judge closes the case, does not dismiss it though. From 2017 to 2018, the case goes on the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, San Francisco, and the United States Supreme Court, Washington, D.C. Appeal denied. February 2019, defendants now confess no legal law existed in 1996 to require or test for HIV or hepatitis C in any boxer. Yet under oath, they stated over 300 times the exact opposite. Trish filed a motion to inform the court a post-ex facto law was used on Tommy. Judge did not reopen the case and defendants pleaded harmless error. February 2020, Quest Diagnostics withheld the original disc of medical records they subpoenaed from hospital that showed Tommy's negative HIV/AIDS results and withheld Tommy's negative HIV results on pathology reports and post-mortem report. July 2020, the Don King multi-million-dollar contract surfaces and filed in court by Trisha Morrison. August 2020, preserved tissue belonging to Tommy Morrison is discovered and presented to the judge. Defendants refused to test the DNA HIV on evidence belonging to Tommy. Then January 2021, judge denies Morrison's motion to test tissue.
In February of 2021, Morrison files an appeal with the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals for the motion to test for DNA/HIV on newly discovered preserved tissue belonging to Tommy Morrison. Then a deadly polar vortex storm hits the Midwest and the package is delayed at an airport with 1.4 million other packages as Federal Express delivers COVID-19 vaccinations as priority per the White House, delaying all other mail. February to June 2021, Trisha now has to argue the delay is an act of God, an excusable delay due to COVID-19 pandemic and deadly polar vortex storm. Numerous documents are filed by all parties, but defendants do not want judges to grant the appeal. Between June and July 2021, a panel of 3 judges at the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals and the Nevada federal judge grant the appeal based on Trisha Morrison showing good cause that the delay was not within her control. The case gets ordered to mediation and then taken off mediation. In September 2021, Trisha further uncovers defendants used tests on Tommy that were now not FDA approved, and no scientific evidence exists of efficiency to even detect/diagnose HIV. Morrison further uncovers the lab in Vegas performed testing on frozen blood from a toxicology freezer in 1996 and not room temperature. Between September and November 21, Morrison receives death threats and files emergency motions with the Ninth Circuit Court as the final ping is located 4 minutes away from the defendant's Quest headquarters in Secaucus, New Jersey. In December of 2021, a new panel of judges at the Ninth Circuit Court suddenly reversed the decision made by the previous panel of the Ninth Circuit Court judges that granted the case to move forward for a decision whether to test the newly discovered biological evidence for DNA/HIV. The new panel of judges closed the case, citing the appeal to have newly discovered evidence tested was untimely and should have been done within 1 year of the judgment, despite no knowledge that the preserved biological evidence ever existed then.
So, February 2022, the case in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for rehearing on the bench on the new December 2021 decision made by 3 new judges. Morrison argues the newly discovered biological evidence was not available for testing in 2016 because it is newly discovered evidence. On March 2022, the Ninth Circuit Court rejects DNA HIV testing, citing it should have been done before 2017. April 2022, Trisha files a petition for writ of certiorari in the US Supreme Court requesting DNA HIV testing on Tommy's newly discovered preserved tissue. The state defendants filed a waiver. Quest filed a reply. Trisha filed a response to that reply. On June the 23rd, 2022, US Supreme Court Conference Day, writ of the certiorari was denied. July 20, a petition for rehearing with the US Supreme Court was filed, and in an August 2022 petition for rehearing was denied. Trisha explained so many twists and turns in this case. All of the above uncovered details were not known to Tommy at any time during his life. Physicians were not actually physicians. Judges recussing themselves in Vegas. Defendants lying under oath. Defendants withhold evidence in front of the court. So we're going to now give you, so that was her timeline, which is very, very useful and very, in detail there. So here's a breakdown from Trisha of all the points that she wants to highlight specifically. So you've got the negative test results for AIDS, the ante-mortem and post-mortem report by experts showing no HIV and AIDS, evidence that the test did not detect the HIV virus, evidence that they lied about the laws and regulations in 1996 and throughout case, evidence that there was a valid Don King multi-million-dollar contract, evidence that Arthur Stormy Weather's opponent was not going to be able to fight anyway, and both Commission and Don King knew this but went ahead with the weigh-in. Evidence that they withheld medical records by burning their own disc and cherry-picking records they wanted the judge to see. Evidence of John Hyatt was never a doctor of medicine and never a pathologist and was never the physician that reviewed Tommy's 1996 results.
Evidence that Mark Ratner knew the statuses quoted in 1996 and in documents throughout the lawsuit did not exist in 1996. Evidence that they secretly lifted the ban on Tommy without anyone knowing in 2006. Biological evidence now exists and defendants do not want to test for HIV or AIDS. Evidence that they used non-FDA approved testing without any clinical or scientific evidence that they even detected HIV or HIV specific antibodies. Evidence that Tommy was not tested for autoimmune disorders that trigger a false positive results, and then on HIV FDA approved testing had he been tested with FDA approved tests. Evidence that Tommy had autoimmune disorders in 2012 and 2013 that triggered false positive results. Evidence that defendants withheld that the test will also react positive to autoimmune disorders, essentially false positive results. And then evidence of the 12 foot of gauze left in Tommy's chest in 2011, and that was the start of Tommy's downfall, and the cause wasn't because of HIV or AIDS. Now, since that point, there is reactions that we've decided to include in here by the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary, and of course via social media and boxing media. So ESPN 30 for 30 withheld the results of the anti-mortem / post-mortem report / negative AIDS test in their documentary. Court records were available from 2014 to them, and their documentary on Tommy came out in 2017. So logically, what Trisha's saying is they had the opportunity to present that information there and then. Then there's the one physician shown on ESPN's 30 for 30 documentary was using a PCR test, which does not detect or diagnose HIV infection, per the inventor of the PCR, Dr. Carey Mullis, and per the test manufacturer, Roche Diagnostics. Tony Holden segments in the documentary state the commission told him Tommy was HIV positive, but the commission is now saying they did not tell Tony Holden that Tommy had HIV. Court records state under oath the commission never stated Tommy had HIV. Court records state under oath again the commission now state they never banned Tommy out of boxing, whereas the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary portrays completely the opposite. Mainstream media won't report on the anti-mortem or post-mortem results, and what Trisha believes was character assassination on the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary, and their best efforts to discredit all the findings by Trisha throughout this course of the campaign that she's been on. And of course, and what's been more difficult for Trisha is the trolls and the death threats throughout the case on Tommy Morrison, and obviously the expert witnesses that have been involved in this.
Yeah, and Trisha, so she's give her reaction to trolls herself. She said, "Show me the post-mortem report showing HIV/AIDS." She says, "Silence." "Show me the ante-mortem report showing HIV/AIDS." Once again, silence. "Name the test that detected and diagnosed the HIV virus." Silence. "Name the AIDS disease that you say Tommy had." Silence. "Show me a photo image of Tommy's blood infested with the virus." Silence. "Show me his sperm, CSF, blood, macrophages, saliva infested with the virus." Silence. And then finally, name the physician that you say diagnosed Tommy with HIV. Silence. So look, we've given a lot of. Trisha's been really helpful there. She's given some fantastic information, and there's some moments in there, especially the post-mortem evidence that that just doesn't seem to come alight. That is really interesting. The other stuff, look, we're gonna counter everything. You've got to. We want to give an argument here, and I think Carlos Acevedo is probably one of the best people to use for this. So to counter some of Trisha's claims here, here's a quote from Carlos Acevedo in his book. He said that in that 2016 lawsuit brought to light dozens of documents revealing medical records that repeat over and over the fact that Tommy Morrison had HIV. These records include prescriptions, credit card statements, test results, memos from physicians, expert testimony, even psychiatric intake notes. The evidence that Morrison, as in Tommy, had been living with HIV for years is overwhelming. Over and over, he admitted publicly to taking HIV medication. To ESPN, to Sports Illustrated, to the Tennessean, to Kansas City Star. His mother, who had come off in several interviews as a straightforward, no-nonsense woman, confirmed that Tommy was on antiretrovirals. So lastly, on the New York Times feature, which we did mention earlier, on the possibility that Tommy Morrison was HIV-free. This is again Carlos Acevedo. He said the same paperwork that Morrison had sent to West Virginia, the Times asked a slew of doctors to interpret them results. Now, these are the West Virginia documents that, this is what he continued. He said, to its credit, the Times added an important caveat to the process. Two nationally renowned HIV experts reviewed those and a third blood test for the New York Times and said they suggested Morrison had been knocked out of the ring by false positive tests. if indeed the new tests are his blood. If Morrison had been miraculously cured of HIV, he would have been the dream desire of every scientist in the world.
Morrison would have been invited to conferences, to 2020 or 60 Minutes, to fun drives, to gala affairs. He would have been the cover story for Time, Newsweek, Scientific American, Discover. But most scientists know better, and for them to have given Morrison a platform based solely on his word would have been insane. To be as famous as he wanted to be the inspiration that he hoped he could be, to be the subject of a Hollywood film or a blockbuster biography, all he had to do was take a supervised test at a reputable academic medical centre and release the results to the public. He did not. He would not. He could not. Now Trisha will be on the show, on the after show, to discuss her thoughts as an addendum to this episode on Tommy. But before we finish, we want to remember one thing that was undeniable, and that is, at the peak of Tommy Morrison's boxing career, he was thoroughly entertaining to watch, and he sold tickets because of his aggressive style and willingness to put it all on the line. Whether he won by knockout or he lost by knockout, he was guaranteed drama, and because of this he was a pay-per-view star. And we'll leave you with one quote from Tommy, and he told Boxing Scene, "I have an exciting style. People pay to watch me, because regardless of the outcome, something exciting is going to happen." And it definitely did. And that is the story of Tommy Morrison for the Darker Side of Boxing season finale. Talking points of this episode is very difficult, this, isn't it, Johnston, for the pair of us, because let's have it right before we make our own opinions on this. We are not scientists. We are not anybody that is in the position to be clued up to make a comment on it on that basis. However, we can only take things at face value and give our own feelings on them. Them feelings might prove to be scientifically wrong at some point, but this is just how it kind of comes across and how it feels to us. And Trisha has done a great job of giving us all the information that she's been going through over the past 10 years and what she's trying to campaign for. And, you know, she's ultimately adamant that Tommy never had HIV, never had AIDS, he never had it, and that there is evidence she believes that is enough there to clear his name. And that is essentially what she's trying to do. She's trying to clear Tommy's name. It's really difficult, this, because you sit there testing your own moral compass about what you actually believe, because the pair of us now can give different opinions on this, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong. And that's one thing that I think people will need to respect with this episode and this story, is that I don't think at the moment there's a right or wrong answer to it, because it's back and forward. Trisha's still going back and forward with this at the moment. So really, we haven't got an ultimate outcome as to whether he really did have HIV and then it developed to AIDS, or whether he never did. And actually what Trisha's saying is 100% true. So we can't sit here and say to Trisha, no, you know, you're not right in what you're saying. We're not scientifically trained. We're not doctors. We can't make them type of comments. We can only give what we feel potentially happened throughout that time of his life. And it is really difficult. It kind of tears me apart a little bit personally, because on one hand I look at his story and I think I'm sort of romanticised by everything that he goes through, and you know, I can't condone some of the bad things that he did, and I don't think anyone would, but I think of his boxing career, I think of his time in Rocky 5, and I think of all the positive stuff, and that's how I remember him. I don't remember him like what happened at the end of his life. I don't choose to remember him that way. I choose to remember him as the fighter that I grew up watching, and that's how I choose to remember him. All this stuff now at this point is really difficult, and it must be difficult for obviously the extended family of Tommy Morrison, because obviously Trish is out there on her own trying to do what she's doing and trying to prove that he didn't have HIV, and contrary to that, there's a lot of people that completely disagree with her. So she's in a very difficult position, and she kindly gave us the information on the basis that this was an opportunity for her to also make sure that when we present a show like this, that her input is in it, and we're telling the story from all possible sides, all possible angles. Now, we never reached out to Tommy's family directly and asked for any quotations for them. What we did do was get quotations that had previously been used in various articles from over the years. Maybe we could have done something of that nature, but I felt like Trisha's very active in keeping Tommy's name alive, and it felt only right that Trisha had the opportunity to have the input into this main episode. And of course, when you finish listening to this, get on and listen to the addendum episode, the after show, because she will tell it herself in her own words. But Johnston, I'm going to come over to you now, because we've had difficult conversations about this and this moment of the episode before, and I know your opinions, you struggle to sort of form an opinion that kind of goes favourably for Trisha and what Trisha believes with Tommy. So it's now your opportunity to talk to me, talk to our listeners, and for Trisha's benefit as well, talk about what you actually feel about that whole situation. But not just that, because obviously that's a negative side, but just about Tommy in general and his life and his career and his everything that he did and everything that he brought to the sport as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the main thing. I mean, the dark side of boxing is all about the outside of the ring exploits, and you could see that he had problems with drugs and drink. That is as clear as day. He made some terrible decisions, and he was a womanizer. Didn't treat women very nicely. You know, he's a good-looking guy, and he was quite open about it. He was open about it throughout his whole life. But yeah, the drugs took over for me. I mean, you could see from his decision making, it was crazy at times. It really was. I mean, what was he doing with all those guns? And yeah, there was some alarm bells there. And obviously, his closest friend Tony Holden seemed to be the guy that was trying to sort of reach out to him. But he's sort of the two Dawns and then Trisha after. You know, it's a sad way and how it all ended for Tommy. In terms of all this information, it's a tricky one because, you know, I was probably a little bit unfair to Trisha when we done our career profiles. We didn't look too much into it with Tommy. It was back in 2020. So, you know, Trisha, if you do listen to that, you know, I didn't mean to. I was a bit Mickey taking, and I didn't mean to, because I respect what you're trying to do for Tommy. So, you know, that's my bad, and I'd like to apologise for how I sort of perceived you and Tommy at the time. I didn't quite look into it as much as I have done for this particular episode. So yeah, apologies for that. But you know, in terms of the HIV, I think the evidence is there that he had extra tests. You know, these HIV, he had many other tests. I know we're looking at the New York State or the Nevada State Commission, where they clearly made mistakes because they went and took back on what they said. They lied under oath. I mean, that's a problem. That's not right for the Nevada Commission to say that he was barred and banned from boxing because he was HIV positive, in their opinion, to then 10 years later pull that back. That isn't good. There's something that needs to be done with that. They need to openly apologize for that, because something wasn't right. But I don't believe that he wasn't HIV. I honestly, I think there's too much evidence there. He had extra tests, and why didn't he? If he was HIV free, you know, he had an opportunity when he came back into boxing where he could have done himself. He could have done a blood test openly, and every time that he was put in a position to get a boxing commission for Arizona or Texas, he didn't comply. He didn't do those tests. Now, if you was absolutely certain in your head that you are not HIV positive, then why on earth wouldn't you do that? That's what I think. And if he was all of a sudden HIV negative, and he wasn't positive at any point, you know, like